I drove 3 hours to my late wife's Lakehouse seeking a moment of peace only to find my key would not turn. The locks were completely changed. Loud music rattled the windows of the sanctuary I built with my own hands. When the door finally opened, my son threw a legal deed against my chest claiming the house was entirely his. But when I saw the date next to my late wife's signature, a cold, calculated fury took over my entire being. I did not scream. I made one quiet phone call. He lost absolutely everything. My name is William. I am 69 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon I thought I had raised a son who respected the blood, sweat, and tears his parents shed for him. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful family member a harsh, unforgettable lesson about respect. The drive up to the Lakehouse was supposed to be my healing ritual. It had been exactly 1 year since my beautiful Gloria passed away. The grief still sat heavy in my chest, a dull ache that never truly went away. I needed the quiet of the lake. I needed to sit on the wooden dock we built together, look out at the water, and remember the woman who stood by my side through 4 decades of hardship and triumph. I pulled my rusted 10-year-old Ford pickup truck onto the dirt road leading to our property. I always preferred to live simply. I never needed flashy cars or designer suits to know my worth. But as I rounded the final bend through the towering pine trees, my heart skipped a harsh beat. The tranquil refuge I expected was gone. Instead, the front lawn was completely covered with expensive luxury vehicles. Sleek sports cars and heavy imported SUVs were parked carelessly over the delicate flower beds Gloria had tended with so much love and patience. A heavy bass thumped through the solid timber walls of the cabin, vibrating the glass panes. I stepped out of my truck, my heavy work boots crunching against the gravel. I walked up the wooden front steps, feeling a tight, uncomfortable knot forming in my stomach. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key I had carried on my key ring for 20 years, and slid it into the front door. It did not go in. I tried again, pushing harder, thinking the metal was just jammed. The key refused to turn. I stepped back and looked closely at the mechanism. The entire lock was brand new. Someone had removed the vintage brass lock I installed with my own hands and replaced it with a cheap, shiny electronic keypad. My sanctuary had been violated without my knowledge. I pounded my fist against the heavy oak door. I pounded again, louder this time, letting the mounting frustration fuel my strikes. The thumping music inside dipped slightly. Heavy footsteps approached from the other side. The door swung open, releasing a cloud of expensive perfume and the sharp, sour smell of alcohol. Megan stood in the doorway. She was my son Derek's wife. She was a 30-year-old white woman who had always looked at me as if I were a piece of dirt on her expensive designer shoes. She held a crystal champagne flute in one hand, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the delicate glass. Her blonde hair was immaculately styled, and her face wore a mask of supreme irritation. But it was what she was wearing that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. Megan was draped in an emerald green silk robe. It was Gloria's robe. She had it tied loosely around her waist, letting the precious hem drag carelessly against the dirty hardwood floor. "William," she sighed, rolling her eyes in sheer annoyance. "What exactly are you doing here? You did not call to announce your visit." I stared at her, struggling to process the sheer audacity of her question. "This is my house, Megan," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "Open this door wide and tell these strangers to get off my property right now." Megan let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She took a slow sip of her champagne and leaned against the doorframe, deliberately blocking my path. "Your house? I think you are very confused, old man. We are hosting a VIP housewarming party today. Derek invited his most important business partners and corporate investors. You cannot just barge in here uninvited like you own the place. And you definitely cannot park that embarrassing rust bucket of a truck in our driveway. It is completely ruining the aesthetic of our event." I felt a massive surge of heat rise in my neck. The sheer disrespect was suffocating. I had paid for every single timber, every roofing nail, and every window pane in this cabin. I had worked until my hands physically bled to give my son a safe place to spend his summer vacations. Now this arrogant woman was treating me like an unwanted, pathetic trespasser. "Take off that robe," I demanded, my voice cutting sharply through the thumping music behind her. "You have absolutely no right to touch my late wife's personal belongings." Megan glanced down at the emerald silk and smirked with deep satisfaction. "Oh, this old thing, I found it stuffed in a dusty closet upstairs. It makes a decent party wrap for the evening. Do not be so incredibly dramatic, William. It is just a piece of old fabric. Now please leave before you embarrass Derek in front of his important friends. Just a piece of fabric." Her cruel words echoed loudly in my mind, igniting a cold, devastating rage that settled deep in my bones. She knew absolutely nothing about sacrifice. 40 years ago, I was a young black man working grueling double shifts at the local lumber yard. I was breaking my back for minimum wage in a world that handed me nothing but closed doors and exhausting labor. I saved every single extra penny I earned for 6 straight months just to buy that specific emerald green silk robe. It was my very first anniversary gift to Gloria. She cried beautiful tears when she opened the box. For the rest of her life, she treated that garment like a sacred treasure, only bringing it out to wear on our most special occasions. It represented our shared struggle, our survival, and our unwavering love for one another. Now this entitled, greedy woman was spilling cheap champagne on it, parading it around in front of drunken strangers as a twisted joke. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or curse. The anger I felt was far too deep and dangerous for shouting. I simply stared at her, memorizing the cruel, arrogant twist of her smile. I planted my boots firmly on the wood, fully ready to push past her and clear the house of every single intruder myself. Before I could take another step forward, a large hand grabbed the door from the inside and pulled it wide open. Derek stepped out onto the porch, my own flesh and blood, the son I had sacrificed everything to raise and protect. He was wearing a tailored designer suit that I knew cost more than my first vehicle. He did not greet me. He did not ask how I was doing on the profoundly painful anniversary of his mother's death. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of annoyance and superiority. "Dad, you are causing a massive scene," he said sharply, adjusting his expensive tie. "I told you repeatedly that we needed space to build our professional network. You cannot just show up here unannounced and harass my wife." I looked at my son, searching his face for any remaining trace of the good boy I used to know. "Derek, why are the locks changed?" I asked, my tone carrying a deadly, unshakable calm. "Why is your wife wearing your mother's commemorative robe? And why are you acting like you own the place I built with my bare hands?" Derek did not flinch or look away. He reached into the inner pocket of his expensive suit jacket and pulled out a crisply folded legal document. He stepped forward and shoved the paper directly against my chest, forcing me to take it from him. "Read it and leave, Dad," he commanded coldly. "It is already done." I unfolded the heavy parchment paper. The bold black letters at the top clearly stated it was a property deed transfer. I scanned the text rapidly, my eyes jumping over the dense legal jargon until I reached the ownership section. The document listed Derek as the sole and exclusive legal owner of the entire Lakehouse property. I flipped to the final page, searching for the authorization. There at the bottom of the page was a signature. It was Gloria's signature. My heart stopped beating for a terrifying fraction of a second. I recognized her unique cursive handwriting, although it looked strangely shaky and forced. But it was not the signature itself that made my breath catch violently in my throat. It was the date stamped right next to the dark blue ink. October 14th. I stared at the date, reading it over and over again to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me in the sunlight. Gloria passed away on October 17th. On October 14th, my beautiful wife was lying in an intensive care unit securely connected to a life support ventilator, trapped in a deep, medically induced coma. She could not open her eyes. She could not breathe on her own. She was absolutely incapable of holding a pen, let alone willingly signing over $1 million property to our son. I slowly lowered the paper. The jagged pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. My son had not just stolen my house behind my back. He had forged a binding legal document and violated his own dying mother in her final hours to accomplish it. I looked up and met Derek's arrogant, unflinching gaze. I did not scream. I carefully folded the forged deed, slipped it securely into my jacket pocket, and turned my back on them without another word. I walked down the wooden steps to my rusted truck, pulled out my cell phone, and prepared to burn their entire stolen world to the ground. I did not scream. I did not throw a punch or shatter the crystal glass in that arrogant woman's hand. A lesser man might have lost his mind right then and there, tearing through that crowd of entitled strangers to reclaim what was rightfully his. Instead, I looked directly at my son, taking in the expensive fabric of his suit and the cowardly shift of his eyes, and I let out a low, cold laugh. It was a sound entirely devoid of any humor, a sound that made the smug expression on Derek's face falter for just a fraction of a second. I turned my back on them without uttering a single word. I walked down those wooden steps with my head held high, leaving the thumping bass and the smell of cheap champagne far behind me. I climbed into my rusted pickup truck, gripped the worn steering wheel, and turned the ignition. I did not look back in the rearview mirror as I drove down the gravel path away from the lake. My mind was no longer clouded by the heavy, suffocating grief of my anniversary. It was crystal clear, sharpened into a lethal and highly focused weapon. The moment my tires hit the main asphalt highway, I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out my secure mobile phone. I dialed a number I had not used since the day we finalized Gloria's estate. The phone rang only twice before a sharp professional voice answered on the other end. It was Mr. Cohen. He was not just a typical family attorney handling wills and testaments. He was a financial shark, a brilliant strategist who operated in the deep, quiet waters of corporate law and private asset protection. Cohen, I said, keeping my voice completely steady over the roar of the truck engine. My son just handed me a forged property deed for the Lakehouse. It bears Gloria's signature dated October 14th. I need you to initiate a full, immediate audit of every single visible account attached to my name and my late wife's estate right this second. There was a brief, heavy silence on the line. October 14th. Cohen repeated his tone, shifting instantly from professional courtesy to absolute predatory alertness. William Gloria was entirely incapacitated on that date. She was on a ventilator in the intensive care unit. I know, I replied coldly, staring at the yellow lines passing rapidly on the highway. I am driving back to the city now. Pull the financial records. I need to know exactly how far his absolute greed has spread. I stared blankly at the road ahead. My son had not merely stolen a vacation home to impress his wealthy new friends. He had actively reached into his dead mother's sacred medical fund and wiped it out completely. He stole the money meant to keep his own father walking, functioning, and healthy in his old age. The depth of that betrayal was breathtaking. It was a vicious, calculated attack on my basic survival. Do not freeze the stolen funds yet. I ordered, my voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying whisper. Let him think he has won. Let him think he is entirely untouchable. But I want you to execute the Black Trust protocol immediately. Activate the hidden security layer on every single primary asset real estate portfolio and shadow account I legally own. Strip my public financial profile down to the bare minimum. Hide the corporate shares and bury the investment portfolios deep behind the legal firewalls. William, promise me you will not crush him immediately. Give our boy a chance to find his own way. I squeezed her hand and made a solemn vow right there by her deathbed. I promise you, my love, I will let them be completely free to make their own choices until they cross the line. I had kept that sacred promise for 6 agonizing months. I had watched in absolute silence as he married Megan, a woman who openly sneered at our heritage and our simple way of life. I had stayed quiet when they ignored my phone calls on holidays and birthdays. I endured their blatant disrespect. But forging a dying woman's signature and stealing her dedicated medical funds was not just crossing the line. It was taking a torch to the bridge and spitting directly on the burning ashes. The grace period was officially over. I owed them nothing anymore. I pulled onto my quiet suburban street just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the pavement. This was my primary residence, a sturdy brick house I had paid off entirely 30 years ago. It was modest on the outside, exactly the way I wanted it, a perfect camouflage for a man of my actual means. But as I parked my truck by the curb, a sharp spike of adrenaline shot through my veins. A sleek black luxury sedan was parked haphazardly right in the middle of my driveway. I did not recognize the license plate. I stepped out of my truck and walked quickly up the concrete path, my senses on high alert. The heavy wooden front door was pushed wide open. Jagged splinters of wood littered the welcome mat, indicating the deadbolt had been violently and unprofessionally forced. I stepped inside silently, the thick hallway carpet absorbing the sound of my heavy work boots. The house was unnaturally quiet, but a faint metallic scraping noise echoed from the corridor leading to my private study. I moved through the familiar shadows of my own home, my breathing slow, deep, and perfectly controlled. I reached the edge of the study and peered carefully around the wooden doorframe. The room was in complete disarray. My personal files, photo albums, and tax documents were thrown carelessly across the hardwood floor, but my eyes locked instantly on the far wall. Derek was standing there sweating profusely, gripping a heavy steel crowbar in his hands. Standing right beside him was a tall, unfamiliar man wearing a pristine white medical lab coat and holding a leather clipboard. Together, they were actively and desperately prying open the heavy steel wall safe hidden securely behind my bookshelf. I stepped fully into the doorway, my heavy boots making a deliberate and solid thud against the hardwood floor. "What exactly do you think you are doing in my house?" I asked. My voice cut through the tense silence like a sharpened blade. "You are forgetting things constantly. You are leaving doors unlocked and neglecting your basic hygiene. Dr. Harrison is here to help us transition you into a secure, full-time assisted living facility where you can be properly supervised by professionals. We are doing this because we love you. We are doing this to protect your assets and your overall well-being." They really thought I was a fragile, gullible old man. They honestly believed a cheap lab coat, a fake smile, and a few rehearsed medical terms would make me doubt my own sanity in my own home. I did not argue with their ridiculous performance. Instead, I reached slowly into my jacket pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped the bright red button on my screen to start a high-definition video recording. I held the camera up, making absolutely sure to capture the broken safe, the dropped crowbar on the floor, and the pale, guilty faces of the two intruders standing in my study. "Let us get this official psychiatric evaluation strictly on the record," I said, taking a slow, highly calculated step toward the fake doctor. "Dr. Harrison, please look directly into the lens and state your full legal name. Following that, I need you to state your state medical board license number so I can verify your credentials with the authorities." The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. He took a quick, panicked step backward until his shoulder blades hit my wooden bookshelf. "I am just an independent consultant," he stammered, raising his hands to cover his face from the camera lens. "This is a private family matter. I was told I was just observing a voluntary intervention. There is absolutely no private matter when you commit a felony home invasion," I replied, my voice booming through the confines of the study, echoing with decades of unchecked authority. "You are currently standing inside my private property alongside a man who just used a steel burglar tool to pry open my locked wall safe. That is breaking and entering in the first degree. That is attempted grand larceny. Furthermore, conspiring to falsely declare a competent senior citizen mentally unfit to steal his estate is a massive federal offense. I am keeping this camera rolling while I dial the police to report a violent home invasion." I pressed the keypad on my phone, letting the bright screen illuminate the dark room. The fake doctor did not hesitate for another second. His self-preservation instincts kicked in immediately. He dropped his clipboard directly onto the floor, shoved past Derek roughly, and sprinted down the hallway like a terrified animal. I heard his frantic footsteps hit the front porch, followed seconds later by the loud, screeching tires of a car speeding recklessly away down the suburban street. Derek stood, completely frozen, in the center of the room. He stared at the empty doorway where his hired accomplice had just fled his chest, heaving with panicked breaths. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and embarrassment. "Dad, please put the phone down," he pleaded, holding his hands up defensively. "You do not understand the financial pressure I'm under right now. I was just trying to secure the family legacy before you made any rash decisions." "Get out of my house, Derek," I commanded, pointing my finger squarely toward the street outside. "You are no longer welcome under this roof. You have lost the right to call me your father." Derek opened his mouth to argue, perhaps to offer another pathetic excuse, but the cold, unwavering fury in my eyes made him snap his mouth shut. He grabbed his expensive designer jacket from the back of my leather reading chair and practically ran out the front door, leaving me entirely alone in the wreckage of my violated study. I lowered my phone and stopped the recording. The sudden silence of the empty house crashed down around me, thick and suffocating. I looked down at the discarded crowbar and the scattered personal documents littering my floor. A heavy, crushing wave of disappointment washed over my chest, squeezing my heart until it physically ached. I stood there and remembered the grueling winters 40 years ago. I remembered working back-to-back night shifts at the lumber yard, my hands blistered and bleeding, my back aching constantly just so I could pay the exorbitant tuition for Derek to attend a prestigious private academy across town. There were countless nights I lied to Gloria, telling her I had already eaten a hot dinner at work just so there would be enough meat on the table for our growing boy to have a second helping. I starved my own body to build a strong, educated, and honorable man. I wanted him to walk through doors that had been slammed shut in my face. Instead, I had financed a weak, greedy coward. A man who would hire a pathetic con artist to declare his own grieving father insane just to steal his retirement money and fund a fake lifestyle. The sheer pathetic nature of his blind ambition was almost harder to bear than the betrayal itself. He desperately wanted the fast track to wealth and high society, but he lacked the spine, the grit, and the character to actually work for it. I pushed the bitter memories aside and walked slowly toward the damaged wall safe. The heavy steel door hung awkwardly on its bent and twisted hinges. Derek had managed to pry it open just enough to reach his greedy hands inside before I interrupted them. I knelt on the floor, pushing aside my life insurance policies, my vehicle titles, and the stack of old tax returns they had carelessly tossed aside in their frantic search for liquid cash. None of those financial papers mattered to me right now. My hands moved frantically, feeling around the dark, dusty corners of the metal compartment. I was looking for one specific item, a small, faded navy blue velvet box. It was the box that held Gloria's antique diamond wedding ring. It was a flawless vintage piece passed down from her great-grandmother. It was the ring I had placed on her delicate finger the day we renewed our vows for our 30th anniversary, surrounded by our closest friends and family. It was the most sacred, irreplaceable possession in my entire life. It was the only physical piece of her legacy I had left to hold on to when the house felt too quiet. I pulled my hands out of the safe. The metal compartment was completely empty. I checked the floor, sifting through the scattered papers with growing desperation. I checked under the desk and beneath the reading chair. The velvet box was gone. My heart stopped beating for a terrifying second, replaced immediately by a burning volcanic rage that consumed every fiber of my being. Derek had not just come for property deeds or emergency cash. He had actively violated his dead mother's memory and stolen her most precious heirloom right out of my home. He and Megan had taken the one singular thing I valued more than my own life. I stood up slowly. My fists clenched so tightly my fingernails dug painfully into my palms, drawing tiny drops of blood. They had crossed the final boundary. The game of patience and observation was officially over. I was going to hunt them down and tear their stolen empire apart piece by piece. I stood amidst the wreckage of my study, my breathing heavy and my mind racing with a cold, terrifying clarity. They had taken Gloria's ring. I needed to find it before Megan's absolute greed melted the platinum down or sold it to an untraceable buyer. I walked over to the bottom drawer of my mahogany desk, pulling out a cracked, outdated tablet. It was Derek's old device. He had discarded it here over a year ago when he bought the newest model, too arrogant and careless to realize he had never wiped the memory or unlinked it from his primary family cloud account. I plugged the tablet into the wall charger, waiting agonizing seconds for the bright logo to illuminate the dark room. I tapped the screen and opened the location tracking application. Derek was always incredibly reckless with his digital footprint. He shared his location constantly to show off his daily visits to expensive downtown restaurants and exclusive executive clubs. The blue dot representing his current phone was moving rapidly away from my suburban neighborhood, fleeing the scene of his crime. But I was not looking for Derek right now. I clicked on the device tab and selected the secondary phone tracker linked to his family account. Megan's phone. The blue dot representing my daughter-in-law was completely stationary. I zoomed in on the digital map, watching the street names sharpen into focus. She was parked downtown, right in the heart of the city's luxury commercial district. The exact location was a high-end estate buyer and vintage jewelry broker. It was a glorified pawn shop dressed up in velvet ropes and mahogany trim. She was trading my wife's legacy for quick, disposable cash. I grabbed my keys, locked the ruined front door of my house, and climbed back into my rusted truck. I drove through the heavy city traffic with reckless, singular focus. I ignored the blaring horns and yellow lights. I pulled up to the curb right outside the gleaming glass storefront of the jewelry broker. Megan's sleek white SUV was no longer parked outside. I had missed her by mere minutes. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, a sharp brass bell announcing my arrival into the pristine, heavily perfumed showroom. The shop owner was a slick, polished man in a tailored gray suit. He stood behind a brightly lit glass display counter, wiping a pair of designer sunglasses with a microfiber cloth. He looked up. his eyes immediately scanning my faded denim jacket, my calloused hands, and my heavy work boots. His professional smile dropped instantly into a flat line of profound condescension. "We are not currently buying scrap metal or bulk silver, sir," he said, completely dismissing my presence and turning back to his merchandise. I walked directly to the counter and slammed my heavy palms flat against the pristine glass, rattling the expensive watches inside. "I am not here to sell," I stated, my voice echoing sharply off the marble floors. "I am here for the vintage 2-carat emerald-cut diamond ring set in platinum that a blonde woman named Megan just brought into your store less than 20 minutes ago." The owner stepped back, crossing his arms defensively over his chest. "Client transactions are strictly confidential. I cannot confirm or deny any purchase made today. Furthermore, that item was legally acquired." The young woman showed her identification and signed the transfer papers. "She told me it was a cheap family hand-me-down she needed to liquidate quickly to purchase a limited edition Hermes handbag she saw on sale at the boutique across the street." A handbag. My chest tightened with a sickening wave of absolute disgust. Megan had traded 40 years of enduring love, loyalty, and deep family history just to buy a piece of leather to parade around her superficial friends. She had pawned my wife's soul for sheer vanity. "How much did you give her for it?" I demanded, my gaze piercing straight through his arrogant facade. "I will not discuss our financial arrangements," he replied, reaching his hand slowly toward the security panic button mounted under the counter. "Leave my store before I call the authorities." I did not flinch. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy jacket and pulled out a thick, tightly bound stack of $100 bills. I had withdrawn this cash from my secure reserve months ago, keeping it safely tucked away for absolute emergencies. I threw the heavy stack onto the glass counter. The thick thud made the owner jump backward. "There is exactly $20,000 in that stack," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "I know you gave her no more than $15,000. You opportunistic brokers never offer full appraisal value to desperate people. You take this cash right now, make your quick $5,000 profit, and hand me my wife's ring. If you press that security button, I will bring a massive team of corporate lawyers down on this establishment by noon, and we will audit every single stolen item sitting in your back vault." The owner stared at the stack of crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. His greed instantly overpowered his arrogance. He swallowed hard, quickly swept the cash off the glass, and retreated to the back room. A minute later, he returned and placed the small navy blue velvet box on the counter. I opened the velvet lid. The diamond caught the bright showroom lights, sparkling brilliantly exactly the way it did the day I first bought it. My hands shook as I gently touched the cold platinum band. A profound, heavy wave of memories washed over my boiling anger. I remembered the grueling 2 years of my youth when I worked 3 separate manual labor shifts every single day. I cleaned dirty industrial warehouses at dawn, hauled heavy timber under the blistering afternoon sun, and washed dishes in a greasy local diner until midnight. My body ached constantly, my hands were permanently blistered, and my work boots were worn through to the bare soles. I survived on cheap coffee and stale bread, saving every single dollar in a rusted tin can hidden safely under my mattress. I did it all just to afford this exact ring. I wanted to give Gloria a piece of undeniable beauty in a world that had only ever shown us hardship and discrimination. It was the ultimate symbol of my devotion, a solid promise that I would build a secure kingdom for her. Now I was buying it back from a greedy stranger because my own son's wife wanted a luxury purse. I snapped the velvet box shut and tucked it safely into my breast pocket, securing it right over my beating heart. As I turned to walk away from the glass counter, the thick rubber edge of my boot caught on a heavy piece of glossy paper lying discarded on the polished marble floor. It had slipped perfectly under the bottom edge of a display case, completely missed by the shop owner, and carelessly dropped by Megan in her frantic rush to secure her luxury shopping money. I bent down and picked up the folded document. It was a formal corporate memorandum printed on heavy, expensive cardstock. I unfolded the pages, my eyes scanning the bold legal header. It was an advanced memorandum of understanding between my son and a massive, ruthless commercial real estate development corporation. The text outlined a fast-tracked binding agreement to completely demolish the Lakehouse property and clear the surrounding timber to build a massive commercial resort. I traced my finger down to the financial execution clause. The purchase price was listed clearly in bold black ink, $1.5 million. The final binding signature from the corporate buyer was scheduled for a private executive dinner this exact coming weekend. The forged deed Derek shoved into my chest earlier today was not just a greedy grab for a free vacation home. It was the necessary key to finalize a massive multi-million-dollar corporate buyout. They were going to bulldoze the sacred sanctuary I built for Gloria and turn it into a concrete parking lot. They were rushing the sale to liquidate the massive asset before anyone could question the legitimacy of the deed transfer. A dark, terrifying smile slowly formed on my face. I folded the corporate memorandum and slid it into my pocket alongside my wife's recovered diamond ring. They believed they had outsmarted a defenseless, clueless old man. They had absolutely no idea that I legally owned the very ground they were standing on. I left the gleaming jewelry store behind, stepping out into the harsh afternoon sun with my wife's diamonds safely resting against my chest. I did not drive back to my violated suburban home. I bypassed the residential neighborhoods entirely and steered my rusted truck toward the industrial district on the far side of the city. Mr. Cohen did not operate out of a towering glass skyscraper with a flashy receptionist. His private office sat hidden behind a heavily reinforced steel door inside a renovated brick warehouse. It was a secure, unlisted location designed for absolute discretion. I bypassed the security keypad with my personal access code and walked down the dimly lit concrete hallway. Cohen was already waiting for me. He sat behind a massive oak desk, his fingers steepled, surrounded by stacks of thick legal binders. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the crumpled corporate memorandum Megan had carelessly dropped, and threw it flat onto the polished wood. "Read this," I commanded, pulling up a heavy leather chair and sitting across from him. "I just recovered Gloria's wedding ring from a high-end pawn shop. My daughter-in-law sold it to buy a designer handbag. But that piece of paper is the real prize she left behind." Cohen adjusted his glasses and picked up the heavy cardstock. His eyes darted rapidly across the bold legal headers and the dense financial execution clauses. The silence in the room grew thick and heavy, punctuated only by the sharp rustle of the paper turning in his hands. He set the document down and let out a low, disbelieving breath. $1.5 million. He stated, his voice laced with professional shock. "Your son is finalizing a fast-tracked commercial buyout with Apex Development. They want to bulldoze the entire Lakehouse property and clear the surrounding timber to build a luxury corporate resort. According to this timeline, the final binding signature is scheduled for a private executive dinner this coming Saturday. Derek is moving with terrifying speed to liquidate the asset before the forged deed can be challenged in probate court." I leaned forward, resting my calloused hands on the edge of the oak desk. "Derek thinks he holds the ultimate winning hand," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, calculating rumble. "He thinks slipping a forged piece of paper past a corrupt notary makes him a millionaire overnight. He believes he stole my entire sanctuary." Cohen looked at me, a sharp, predatory smile slowly forming on his face. He reached into his bottom drawer and pulled out a heavy black binder secured with a combination lock. He punched in the numbers, opened the binder, and laid a pristine, notarized architectural map of the Lakehouse property flat on the desk. "Let us review the actual reality of the situation," Cohen said, tapping a silver pen against the blueprint. Derek forged his mother's signature on the residential deed. Legally, the local county records now show him as the sole owner of the physical wooden structure. He owns the walls, the roof, the windows, and the porch. However, Derek is a deeply arrogant and profoundly uneducated man. He never bothered to hire a real estate attorney to run a comprehensive title search. He assumed the house and the land were packaged as a single, indivisible entity. I stared at the blueprint, feeling a deep, powerful surge of satisfaction replacing the bitter sting of betrayal. "Exactly," I replied smoothly. "Gloria loved that cabin. I put her name on the residential deed because I wanted her to feel an absolute sense of ownership over the home we built together. But I never put her name on the dirt underneath it." Cohen traced his silver pen along the outer boundary lines of the map, outlining the vast acres of dense timber, the long winding driveway, and the private shoreline. 35 years ago, William, you established a private limited liability company entirely shielded from public records. That LLC legally purchased the bedrock, the soil, the private access road, the electrical grid connections, and the exclusive water rights to the dock. The wooden cabin simply sits on top of your earth. You lease the ground to the residential structure for $1 a year. Your son holds a forged deed to a floating wooden box. He has absolutely zero legal rights to the ground it sits upon. He cannot pave a parking lot. He cannot chop down a single pine tree. He cannot even legally walk down the driveway without your explicit corporate permission. The deed he holds is nothing but a hollow, worthless shell. I looked at the bold boundary lines, my mind drifting back to a painful, defining chapter of my youth. When I was 25 years old, I started my very first independent contracting business. I was a young, ambitious black man trying to carve out a legitimate piece of the American dream. I poured my entire life savings into purchasing a small commercial lot to build a supply warehouse. I trusted a slick, fast-talking white developer who handed me a thick stack of confusing paperwork. I signed it blindly, eager to start building. 2 months later, I discovered he had only sold me the rights to the dilapidated building on the lot while retaining full ownership of the commercial land beneath it. He immediately evicted me, seized my renovations, and left me completely bankrupt. I lost everything I had worked for because I did not understand the ruthless, hidden traps of real estate law. I swore on my life I would never be a victim again. I spent the next decade relentlessly studying property codes, corporate structuring, and asset protection. I learned to use brilliant lawyers like Cohen to build impenetrable legal fortresses around my family. I protected Gloria fiercely without ever burdening her with the complex, ugly realities of corporate warfare. My son grew up entirely shielded by my invisible armor, and now his sheer ignorance was going to destroy him. Cohen flipped to the final page of the developer's memorandum Megan had dropped. He highlighted a specific paragraph buried deep within the fine print of the execution clause. William looked closely at the terms of the commercial buyout Cohen instructed, tapping the text emphatically. Apex Development is a massive, ruthless corporation. They do not play games with their investments. They require Derek to sign a legally binding guarantee that he holds clear, unencumbered title to the entire property, including the land and the water rights. They are rushing the deal to break ground by next month. I leaned in, reading the dense legal terminology carefully. My eyes locked onto the penalty clause. If the seller signs the final contract but fails to deliver absolute clear title to the land, they are in direct breach of a commercial agreement. Apex Development includes a massive punitive damages clause to cover their lost time architectural fees and delayed construction schedules. What is the exact penalty for a breach of contract, I asked, though I could already see the bold numbers printed on the page. Cohen pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, his eyes gleaming with clinical precision. If Derek signs this agreement on Saturday night and fails to produce the land deed, he will be personally and legally liable for a breach of contract penalty fee. The fine is exactly $300,000. It is payable immediately upon default. Apex will place a massive lien on every single asset he currently owns until the debt is satisfied. The silence in the secure office was absolute. The trap was laid out perfectly in front of me. Derek and Megan were busy picking out expensive champagne for their fancy executive dinner, completely unaware they were preparing to step onto a massive financial landmine. They thought they were securing a multi-million-dollar future, but they were actually signing their own financial death warrant. Cohen closed the black binder and looked at me seriously. William, I can draft a cease and desist order right now. We can file an emergency injunction with the county court by tomorrow morning. We can freeze the entire transaction, notify Apex Development about the forged deed, and stop your son from finalizing the sale before Saturday night. All you have to do is give me the word, and I will shut this entire operation down. I stood up slowly, adjusting the collar of my faded denim jacket. I felt the hard, reassuring shape of Gloria's velvet ring box resting safely against my chest. I thought about the sheer disrespect in Megan's eyes as she dragged my wife's sacred robe across the dirty floor. I thought about Derek breaking down my front door, hiring a fake doctor, and trying to throw his own father into a psychiatric ward just to steal my hard-earned peace. They wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate theft. I was going to show them exactly what a real predator looked like. I looked down at Cohen, my expression entirely devoid of mercy or hesitation. Do not file the injunction, I commanded, my voice echoing with terrifying, unshakable authority. Do not contact the developer and do not block the transaction. Let them walk into that fancy restaurant. Let them drink their expensive wine and shake hands with those corporate executives. Let them sign the contract. Saturday night arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the air. I parked my rusted Ford pickup truck down the street from Le Bernardin, the most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant in the financial district. The glowing facade of the building radiated wealth, a fortress of glass and polished brass designed to keep people like me out. I did not wear a tuxedo. I wore the same faded denim jacket, heavy denim jeans, and scuffed leather work boots I wore to the lumber yard 40 years ago. I wanted them to see exactly who they were dealing with. I bypassed the valet, pushed through the heavy revolving doors, and stepped onto the plush, sound-absorbing carpet. The maitre d' stepped forward immediately, his eyes scanning my worn clothes with practiced disdain, preparing to escort me back to the street. I did not break my stride. I looked directly into his eyes with a cold, unyielding authority that made him freeze in his tracks, stepping aside without uttering a single word. I navigated the dimly lit, elegant dining room, the soft clinking of crystal glasses and hushed, wealthy conversations surrounding me. I spotted them in the private glass-enclosed VIP section at the back of the restaurant. Derek and Megan were seated across from three older, distinguished men in sharp Italian suits, the executives from Apex Development. A bottle of vintage champagne rested in a silver ice bucket. Derek was holding up a crystal flute. A smug, victorious smile plastered across his face as he prepared to offer a toast. I pushed the glass door of the private room open. The heavy hinges made a soft but distinct click. Megan was the first to see me. The triumphant smile vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a mask of absolute horror and vicious, unrestrained fury. She slammed her champagne flute down on the pristine white tablecloth, the expensive liquid spilling over the edges. "What in the world are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice sharp and loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. She turned immediately to the Apex executives, waving her hand dismissively in my direction. "Gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this pathetic intrusion. This is my husband's father. He is a confused, delusional old freeloader who has completely lost his mental faculties. He has been wandering around demanding handouts. Security will escort him out in just a moment." Derek jumped up from his chair, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. He walked toward me, grabbing my arm, desperate to shove me back out the door before his multi-million-dollar illusion shattered. "Dad, get out of here right now," he muttered under his breath, his grip tight and frantic. "You are ruining the most important night of my life." I did not yell. I did not pull my arm away or cause a physical scene. I simply turned my head and stared down at Derek's hand, gripping my jacket, until he nervously let it go, stepping back as if he had touched a burning stove. I walked calmly past him and approached the center of the table. The three Apex executives stared at me in profound confusion, their perfectly rehearsed corporate smiles faltering. The lead executive, a silver-haired man with sharp, calculating eyes, looked from Derek to me, clearly annoyed by the interruption to his multi-million-dollar acquisition. I reached inside my heavy denim jacket and pulled out the thick black folder Mr. Cohen had meticulously prepared for me. I did not say a word to Megan, who was still practically vibrating with rage. I looked directly at the lead executive and dropped the heavy legal binder right onto the center of the table, directly over the ceremonial copy of their unexecuted purchase agreement. The heavy thud rattled the expensive silverware. "Read it." I commanded, my voice low, steady, and echoing with absolute, unshakable authority. "Before you sign a single document transferring $1.5 million to my son, I strongly suggest you review the actual bedrock of your investment." The executive frowned, visibly offended by my tone, but his corporate survival instincts kicked in. He flipped open the black folder. His eyes immediately locked onto the certified architectural blueprints, the heavily stamped county land deeds, and the ironclad LLC ownership documents bearing my name. The silence in the VIP room became suffocating. The soft jazz music playing overhead seemed to fade away completely. I watched the executive's eyes dart rapidly back and forth across the dense legal text. I watched his breathing stop. I watched the healthy, confident color completely drain from his face, leaving him a pale, sickly shade of gray. He flipped to the second page, verifying the boundary lines, the private access road, and the exclusive water rights. He looked up at Derek, his expression morphing from mild annoyance into sheer, unadulterated corporate terror. "What is this?" Derek, the executive, asked, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You presented us with a residential deed claiming free and clear ownership of the entire Lakehouse property." Derek swallowed hard, completely oblivious to the legal bomb sitting on the table. "I do own it. I have the signed deed from my mother." The executive slammed his hand down on the folder. "You own a wooden box, you absolute fool. You do not own a single inch of the dirt underneath it. The access road, the shoreline, the foundation, it all belongs to a private holding company registered to this man standing right here. You tried to sell us a commercial development site that you legally cannot even walk across. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy silence do the work. I felt a profound, deeply satisfying surge of pride swelling in my chest. Decades ago, when I first started my contracting business, society quickly taught me a very harsh reality. A black man raising his voice in a room full of wealthy, powerful executives would only be labeled aggressive, unpredictable, or dangerous. I would have been escorted out in handcuffs without a second thought. So I learned a completely different kind of power. I learned the cold, absolute violence of corporate law, asset protection, and ironclad contracts. I learned that true power does not need to shout or throw punches. True power stands quietly in the room while the numbers, the legal stamps, and the undeniable facts absolutely crush your opponents into dust. I did not need to hurl insults at Megan. I did not need to scream at my son for his betrayal. I simply placed the undeniable legal reality on the table and let it suffocate their greedy, arrogant dreams. Cohen had armed me perfectly. My silence was a fortress they could not breach, and their own ignorance was the exact weapon that was currently destroying them. The lead Apex executive stood up so violently his heavy mahogany chair tipped over and crashed onto the floor. He glared at Derek with a look of absolute venomous hatred. "You arrogant, incompetent fraud," the executive spat, his voice shaking with fury. "We mobilized our entire architectural firm. We secured municipal zoning permits. We diverted millions in liquid capital based on your fraudulent representation of clear title." He reached across the table, grabbed the ceremonial copy of the $1.5 million purchase agreement, and violently tore it right down the middle, tossing the shredded pieces directly into Derek's face. "We are exercising the penalty clause effective immediately. You are in direct, catastrophic breach of contract. You owe Apex Development $300,000 in punitive damages, and I expect the wire transfer by Monday morning. If that money is not in our accounts, our legal team will place a massive lien on every single asset you possess and bankrupt you into the ground." The executive stormed out of the private room without looking back. Megan's entire fake, luxurious world shattered in an instant. The reality of a $300,000 debt crashed down on her. She completely lost her mind. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged madness. "You ruined everything, you miserable old man," she screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. She lunged across the dining table, her hands hooked into claws, desperately trying to slap my face and tear at my clothes. Glasses shattered and silverware scattered across the room. I did not even flinch. Before her manicured nails could reach me, two massive restaurant security guards, already alerted by the shouting, burst through the glass doors. They intercepted Megan mid-lunge, grabbing her arms and dragging her backward. She thrashed wildly in her expensive designer dress, kicking and screaming obscenities as they hauled her out of the VIP room. Derek stood frozen, staring at the torn contract on the floor, his breathing shallow and panicked. I casually adjusted the collar of my denim jacket, looked at my son's completely broken reality, and walked calmly out of the restaurant, ready for the next phase of their absolute destruction. The morning sun had barely crested over the neighborhood trees when the violent pounding began. I was sitting at my kitchen table sipping a black coffee and watching the steam rise into the quiet air. My sanctuary had already been violated once this week, so the heavy, frantic thuds echoing off my front door did not startle me. I knew exactly who was standing on the porch. Before I could even stand up to unlock the deadbolt, the heavy oak door flew open with a sickening crack. The wood splintered violently around the frame, the metal lock breaking under the force of a desperate kick. It was a testament to sheer, unadulterated panic. Derek stood in my entryway looking absolutely nothing like the polished, arrogant executive from the Michelin-starred restaurant the night prior. His designer suit was deeply wrinkled, his expensive tie was missing, and dark, exhausted bags hung heavily under his bloodshot eyes. He stormed into my kitchen, breathing like a cornered animal, and slammed a thick stack of blank transfer deeds right onto my kitchen table, knocking over my coffee mug. The dark liquid spilled across the wood, dripping onto the floor, but I did not even blink. "Sign them!" Derek roared, his voice cracking with unchecked hysteria. "Sign the land over to me right now, Dad. You have to fix this." Apex Development sent their corporate lawyers after me at 6 o'clock this morning. They are threatening to seize my cars, my bank accounts, and Megan's business if I do not wire them $300,000 by tomorrow. You have to sign the holding company over to me so I can finalize the sale and get them off my back. I slowly picked up my overturned mug and set it upright deliberately, ignoring the mess. I looked at the frantic, pathetic man standing in my kitchen. "You created a fraudulent contract. I stated, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. You forged your dying mother's signature to steal a house you had no right to claim. You walked into a corporate boardroom and lied to ruthless investors. Now the bill for your arrogance has come due. I will not sign a single document to save you from the consequences of your own absolute greed. Derek stared at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The desperate pleading look in his eyes suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, malicious darkness that I had never seen in him before. The panic subsided into a twisted, arrogant smirk. He reached into his wrinkled jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, tossing it onto the table right beside the blank deeds. I knew you would be stubborn, Derek sneered, his tone dripping with venom. I knew you would try to act high and mighty, but you are forgetting one very important detail, Dad. You are just a frail, retired old man, and I am the son desperately trying to protect you from your own deteriorating mind. I looked down at the envelope. I did not need to open it to know exactly what kind of poison it contained. What did you do, Derek? I asked, my voice dangerously flat. I went to a judge first thing this morning, Derek replied, crossing his arms over his chest in a pathetic display of dominance. I presented a sworn psychiatric affidavit signed by Dr. Harrison, the same doctor you threatened and chased out of this house. He documented your extreme paranoia, your aggressive tendencies, and your complete inability to manage your own basic daily affairs. Based on his expert medical testimony, a county judge granted an emergency temporary guardianship order. Effective as of 1 hour ago, every single bank account registered to your public Social Security number has been legally and completely frozen. I remained perfectly still in my chair, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his sinister move. Derek stepped closer, leaning over the kitchen table to invade my personal space. Your meager state pension is blocked, he whispered maliciously. Your checking account is locked. Your basic credit cards will decline at every single terminal in the city. You cannot buy groceries. You cannot pay for your electricity. You cannot even afford a gallon of gas for that rusted truck sitting in your driveway. You are completely and utterly cut off from the world. He was utilizing the legal system to choke the life out of me. He truly believed my entire financial existence was limited to a monthly government check and a modest savings account. He thought he had severed my only lifeline, cutting off my air supply to force my hand. I looked at the legal injunction resting on my table, and a slow, bitter smile crept across my face. It was not a smile of defeat, but of profound, heartbreaking realization. I looked up at the man standing before me, tracing the familiar lines of his face, searching for the boy I once loved so fiercely. When Derek was just 10 years old, the local economy crashed. The lumberyard cut my hours in half. We had barely enough money to keep the heat on during the freezing winter months. But Derek had earned a spot in an expensive, prestigious preparatory school program, and he needed a proper uniform and daily lunch money to fit in with the wealthy children. For 3 straight years, I literally starved myself. I skipped breakfast and ate nothing but stale crackers for lunch, enduring sharp, blinding stomach pains every single afternoon just so I could hand my son a crisp $10 bill every morning. I sacrificed the basic nourishment of my own body to ensure he never felt inferior. Now, decades later, that same son was weaponizing a corrupt legal system to intentionally starve his father to death. He wanted to watch me suffer, hoping hunger and desperation would force me to surrender my dignity and my land to pay off his corporate debts. Derek mistook my bitter smile for the terrified realization of a defeated old man. He tapped the stack of blank deeds with his index finger, his arrogance swelling to an unbearable peak. You have exactly 3 days before the food in your refrigerator runs out and the utility company shuts off your power, Derek taunted, turning his back on me and heading toward the splintered front door. I will be back on Monday morning. You can either sign the land over to me so I can sell it to Apex, or you can sit in the dark and starve. The choice is entirely yours, old man. He stepped out of the house and slammed the broken door behind him. I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, listening to the aggressive roar of his engine as he sped away down the suburban street. He was so confident in his victory. He thought he had checkmated a helpless pensioner. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear for the son I had officially lost. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my secure mobile phone. I dialed my attorney's private line, the heavy silence of the house wrapping around me like a protective cloak. Cohen. I said, my voice resonating with an absolute terrifying calm. Derek just executed a temporary guardianship order using the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. He has officially frozen my public checking accounts and locked my state pension cards. I am seeing the alerts on the public registry now, Cohen replied smoothly, unbothered by the supposed crisis. Should I file the counter motion to destroy the doctor's credentials and lift the freeze? No, I commanded, staring at the spilled coffee on my table. Let him have his illusion of control. Let the pension cards stay locked permanently and throw away the key. It is time to execute the final protocol. Open the Black Trust. Cohen did not hesitate. He simply typed a highly complex sequence of commands into his secure terminal. The screen flashed a brilliant green, unlocking a financial fortress I had kept buried and untouched for 3 decades. My son honestly believed my entire life amounted to splinter sweat and a meager state pension. He thought I was nothing but a tired, uneducated old man who swung a heavy hammer until his back gave out. He was completely wrong. 30 years ago, after I was swindled out of my first commercial lot, I realized that working with my hands would only buy me basic survival, not true power. So I took every single dollar I saved from my manual labor and bought a quiet 5% stake in a struggling local lumber supplier. Over the decades, that small supplier grew into a massive multi-state building materials supply chain. I never put my name on the headquarters building. I never attended the flashy corporate galas or posed for business magazines. I remained a completely silent shareholder operating exclusively through offshore holding companies and impenetrable legal trusts. While Derek was busy taking out massive loans to buy designer suits and luxury cars to impress people who fundamentally despised him, my corporate dividends were quietly compounding in the dark. The Black Trust was the ultimate repository of that invisible empire. It held exactly $12 million in highly liquid, untraceable capital. It was an absolute financial weapon waiting patiently in the shadows for the day I needed to protect my family. Now I was going to use it to utterly destroy the monsters who had infiltrated my bloodline. I drove my rusted pickup truck away from my ruined house and headed straight to the private underground parking garage of Cohen's office building. As I rode the secure elevator up to the executive suite, my personal cell phone buzzed violently in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text message from an unknown number. I knew immediately it was Megan. She could not resist the urgent, toxic need to gloat over her perceived victory. The message was dripping with her usual arrogant cruelty. "Are you enjoying the dark, William? Have you started digging through the neighborhood trash cans for your dinner yet? Derek said your accounts are locked tight. You should have just signed the house over when you had the chance. Enjoy the hunger." I stared at the glowing screen. She was actively mocking a man she genuinely believed was starving to death in a cold, empty house. I did not reply. I did not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked through the heavy steel doors of Cohen's office. Cohen was waiting with a steaming cup of black coffee and a thick stack of financial portfolios spread across his polished mahogany desk. I sat down and placed my hands flat on the table, my mind completely focused on the execution of my strategy. Derek and Megan have built their entire glamorous lifestyle on a fragile mountain of debt, I stated coldly. They do not own a single thing. They lease their luxury cars, they finance their designer clothes, and they mortgage their fake success. I want to buy every single piece of their debt right now. Cohen nodded slowly, his fingers flying rapidly across his encrypted keyboard. He pulled up their public credit profiles, property records, and corporate filings. "It is all right here," William Cohen confirmed, adjusting his glasses as he read the glowing data. "Derek has a massive high-interest balloon mortgage on his downtown penthouse. He leases both the Porsche and the Mercedes. Megan took out a substantial commercial loan to open her upscale beauty salon, using the expensive salon equipment as her primary collateral. Their personal credit cards are absolutely maxed out to the limit. They are barely treading water, living paycheck to paycheck, just to cover the minimum interest payments. Buy it all, I commanded without a shred of hesitation. Contact the primary lenders, the mortgage holders, and the commercial banks. Use the liquid capital from the Black Trust. Offer them a lucrative premium to purchase the debt portfolios and transfer the promissory notes directly to my holding company immediately. Do not leave a single penny unaccounted for." As Cohen began executing the massive wire transfers and contacting the lending institutions, my mind drifted back to the man who taught me how to truly survive in this ruthless world. His name was Robert, the original owner of the lumber yard where I broke my back in my early 20s. Robert was a quiet, unassuming man who drove a beat-up sedan and wore patched denim overalls, yet he owned half the commercial real estate in our entire county. He pulled me aside one evening after a brutal 14-hour shift and gave me the most important lesson of my life. William Robert had said, his voice raspy from sawdust and age. New money shouts, but old wealth whispers. Fools use money like a megaphone to announce their presence to strangers and inflate their fragile egos. Smart men use money like a surgical scalpel. You keep it hidden, you keep it sharp, and you only bring it out when you need to cut out a cancer. I took Robert's profound wisdom to heart. I built my empire in absolute silence. I let Derek and Megan mistake my humility for weakness, allowing them to hang themselves with their own arrogance. The heavy industrial printer in the corner of Cohen's office whirred to life, spitting out dozens of pages of thick, legally binding contracts. Cohen gathered the warm papers, stamped them firmly with his official notary seal, and slid the massive stack across the mahogany desk toward me. He handed me a heavy gold pen. I signed my name over and over again, each stroke of the ink representing another heavy nail in the coffin of their fake, luxurious world. The entire aggressive buyout process took less than 2 hours. Wealth moves incredibly fast when there is absolutely no limit to the capital backing it. Cohen closed the final leather folder and looked up at me, a sharp, dangerous smile resting on his face. "It is completely done, William," he announced smoothly. "The bank transfers have fully cleared. The holding company now legally possesses the promissory notes for Derek's penthouse, the commercial lease for Megan's salon, and the legal titles to both of their luxury vehicles. You have also acquired their outstanding credit card debt through a third-party collection agency buyout." I set the gold pen down on the desk. The sheer magnitude of the shift in power was intoxicating. Derek thought he had brilliantly cornered me by freezing my meager state pension. He thought he had starved me into submission by locking me out of a few $1,000s. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed the keys to his entire existence over to his worst enemy. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, feeling the absolute weight of my newly weaponized empire. From this exact second forward, my son and his cruel wife owned absolutely nothing. I was their landlord. I was their bank. I was the absolute master of their financial survival. I was officially the sole legal creditor of Derek and Megan, and I was preparing to call in every single debt they owed. The morning sun beat down on the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of Megan's upscale beauty salon located in the most expensive commercial district in the entire city. She had named her business Aura, a pretentious establishment draped in white Italian marble, imported gold fixtures, and sparkling crystal chandeliers. It was a place deliberately designed to make average, hardworking people feel deeply inferior the moment they stepped through the heavy glass doors. She charged $300 for a basic haircut, selling an illusion of extreme exclusivity to women who desperately wanted to feel important. Right at 10 o'clock in the morning, a private courier in a crisp, dark uniform walked past the plush velvet waiting chairs and handed a thick, certified legal envelope directly to the front desk receptionist. The receptionist immediately rushed the heavy sealed document back to Megan's private office. Megan tore open the thick parchment with her manicured nails, likely expecting another exclusive invitation to a high society charity gala, or a minor tax form she could easily ignore. Instead, she found an official corporate mandate from a firm named Obsidian Property Management, a subsidiary holding company I had formed specifically for this exact tactical strike. The bold, undeniable legal text laid out a catastrophic financial reality. The document formally notified her that the commercial building she operated in had undergone an immediate and total change in ownership. Under the aggressive restructuring clauses hidden deep within the fine print of her original lease agreement, her monthly rent was instantly increasing by 300%. Furthermore, the massive commercial loan she had used to purchase her expensive laser machines, imported salon chairs, and premium product inventory had been completely acquired by the new management firm. Due to extreme high-risk financial markers suddenly appearing on her joint marital credit profile, the new holding company was calling the loan. The document demanded immediate and full repayment of the outstanding balance within 48 hours. Failure to comply would result in the immediate seizure of all physical assets inside the salon and a full permanent padlocking of the commercial premises. The sterile, quiet air of her luxury office shattered as she read the numbers printed in bold black ink. Her perfectly manicured fingers crushed the expensive cardstock. The glittering empire she projected to the world was suddenly collapsing under the crushing weight of a single piece of paper. Megan did not pause to consult a financial advisor or rationally evaluate the devastating legal documents sitting on her desk. She snatched her expensive smartphone with shaking hands and aggressively dialed the toll-free corporate number printed at the very top of the management letterhead. She intended to unleash a massive storm of verbal abuse, fully expecting to terrorize some low-level customer service representative into reversing the financial mandate. She had absolutely no idea that the phone call was being routed directly to a highly secure communication terminal inside Mr. Cohen's underground office. I sat calmly in the heavy leather chair, staring at the flashing green light on the digital console as the incoming call chimed. Cohen nodded silently and engaged a sophisticated audio modification program on his computer. The software immediately deepened my voice, masking my natural tone with a cold, synthesized, and untraceable metallic resonance. I pressed the answer button and let the secure line open. Obsidian Property Management. I stated, my modified voice sounding like a ruthless, faceless corporate entity completely devoid of any human empathy. State your account number. Megan did not bother with any professional formalities. Her voice erupted through the office speakerphone in a shrieking, unhinged tirade. "Do you have any earthly idea who you are dealing with?" she screamed, the shrill pitch of her voice echoing sharply within the quiet confines of the room. "I am the owner of this establishment. You cannot just buy a commercial building and raise the rent by 300% in a single morning. You cannot call my business loan out of nowhere. I am married to a highly successful executive. We are closing a multi-million-dollar real estate deal this exact weekend. I have a massive team of ruthless corporate lawyers who will sue your pathetic management company into absolute bankruptcy for harassment and illegal breach of contract." I listened to her frantic, desperate threats, my expression completely unmoved by her tantrum. "Your original commercial lease contained a standard variable rate clause triggered by a transfer of primary ownership," I replied smoothly, reading directly from the highlighted legal text Cohen had placed right in front of me. "Your commercial loan explicitly outlined an acceleration clause based on plummeting credit scores and defaulted secondary mortgages attached to your spouse. You are classified as a high-risk liability. You will pay the new rental rate and you will satisfy the loan in full within 48 hours, or our security teams will arrive to chain your doors and confiscate your equipment. You have absolutely no legal standing to fight this." Megan gasped loudly over the speaker, her breathing turning jagged and frantic as the cold, undeniable reality of my words slammed into her fragile ego. I listened to her hyperventilate through the speaker, feeling a profound sense of justice taking root in my chest. Megan was the absolute embodiment of dangerous vanity and extreme arrogance. She deeply despised the working class. I remembered the Thanksgiving dinner where she openly mocked my calloused hands and my faded denim jacket, blissfully unaware that those very hands had built the financial foundation her husband stood upon. She had constructed her entire glittering beauty empire purely on mountains of toxic debt and massive commercial loans she could never actually afford. Her entire identity was a hollow, heavily mortgaged shell. She used borrowed money to buy expensive imported leather chairs and crystal mirrors just to look down on women who worked honest, exhausting jobs. She demanded absolute perfection and endless luxury, yet she brought absolutely nothing of actual value to the table. She was a financial parasite feeding on credit sustained entirely by the flimsy illusion of wealth. Now the massive bill for her immense arrogance was sitting right on her desk, and the fragile house of cards she called a career was rapidly crumbling to dust. She had spent years making me feel small and insignificant in my own home, and now she was experiencing the terrifying vulnerability of losing everything she valued. I pressed the advantage, knowing exactly how to manipulate her explosive, unchecked temper. I leaned closer to the microphone, my modified voice dripping with calculated corporate disdain. "Your threats of legal action are completely hollow, ma'am," I stated coldly. "Our financial background check indicates your husband is deeply in debt and fundamentally compromised. The real estate deal you mentioned is currently collapsing. You have zero liquidity in your accounts. You have no actual power in this situation. You are entirely at the mercy of this firm." Megan completely snapped. The carefully curated mask of a high society business owner shattered into a million jagged pieces. The sheer desperation and blinding rage overrode every single ounce of her common sense and self-preservation. "You listen to me, you arrogant corporate parasite," Megan roared, her voice tearing at the microphone in absolute hysteria. "You know absolutely nothing about my power or my money. My husband and I hold the deed to a massive lakeside property. We are selling it to Apex Development for $1.5 million this week. I do not care about his current debts because I hold the keys to an absolute fortune." I interrupted her quickly, pushing her directly toward the dangerous ledge she was balancing on. "A property deed means absolutely nothing if the original owner contests the sudden transfer," I challenged her. "You have no secure collateral." Megan lost all remaining control, her fury blinding her to the massive legal trap I had just set for her. "Nobody is contesting anything," she screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice dripping with venomous pride. "That pathetic old man signed the transfer papers while he was lying in a hospital bed in a deep coma. We took his thumbprint and forged the documents perfectly. He is a brain-dead fool, and I hold all the power." I smiled a cold, victorious smile that reached my eyes. I reached out and pressed a single red button on Cohen's terminal, stopping the digital recording device. The hidden software had captured her entire frantic, unhinged confession in pristine, high-definition audio. Her own arrogant, cruel mouth had just handed me the definitive, irrefutable weapon to completely destroy her life and send her straight to a federal prison cell. While Megan was sealing her own fate with her hysterical confession over the phone, Derek was experiencing his own rapid, terrifying descent into absolute ruin. The following morning, he walked into his prestigious investment firm expecting to somehow charm his way out of the Apex Development disaster. He believed his silver tongue and tailored suit could fix the catastrophic breach of contract. Instead, he was met in the gleaming glass lobby by the head of human resources and 2 armed corporate security guards. A routine internal audit had flagged a series of highly unauthorized, desperate transactions. In his blind panic to cover the $300,000 penalty he owed the real estate developers, Derek had attempted to leverage his firm's secure client holding accounts as collateral for a short-term bridge loan. It was a massive, unforgivable violation of federal financial regulations. He was stripped of his corporate access badge, his company laptop, and his dignity right in front of his sneering colleagues. They escorted him out of the building with nothing but a small cardboard box. He was officially and permanently blacklisted from the entire financial sector, with his public accounts completely frozen by the very same guardianship order he had maliciously enacted against me, and his credit utterly destroyed by the Black Trust. Buyout. Traditional banks laughed directly in his face. He spent the entire afternoon making frantic, sweating phone calls from a cheap burner phone, sliding further and further down the financial food chain until he had no choices left. He was forced to seek out the dangerous, unregulated world of underground shadow lending. By nightfall, Derek found himself standing in the dimly lit, unmarked waiting room of an anonymous private equity firm located deep in the city's industrial warehouse district. It was a place where desperate men went when they ran out of legal options. A place that dealt in exorbitant interest rates, brutal collection tactics, and total financial ruin. He sat on a cheap leather sofa, his once pristine suit now wrinkled and heavily stained with nervous sweat. He clutched a fabricated portfolio of his remaining assets, ready to sign away his soul just to get enough liquid cash to keep his fake life from imploding. The heavy oak door to the inner office finally clicked open. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out of the shadows and took a seat behind a massive steel desk. Derek leaned forward, immediately launching into a frantic, rehearsed pitch about his temporary cash flow problems and his supposedly guaranteed future corporate earnings. He offered massive illegal interest returns, begging the man for a $500,000 lifeline. The director sat in absolute silence, letting Derek completely exhaust himself with his pathetic lies. Then the man leaned forward into the overhead light, pushing his silver-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose. It was Mr. Cohen, my brilliant, ruthless attorney. Derek stopped speaking mid-sentence. His eyes widened in profound confusion, trying to place the familiar, sharp face. Cohen did not offer a polite greeting. He opened a thick black binder and began reading Derek's disastrous financial portfolio aloud. He detailed the exact amount of the Apex penalty, the fraudulent corporate leverage, and the staggering credit card debt. Derek felt the last remaining oxygen leave the room. He realized he was not sitting across from a gullible loan shark. He was sitting across from the executioner. I watched the entire pathetic encounter unfold through a live encrypted video feed from the safety of Cohen's secondary office. A cold, profound sadness washed over my chest, mingling heavily with the absolute necessity of this harsh lesson. I looked at the high-definition monitor and saw a hollow, broken shell of a man. Just days ago, Derek was parading around the Lakehouse in $3,000 Italian suits, sneering at my faded denim jacket and my calloused hands. He had stood in my living room with his chest puffed out, demanding I hand over my property, treating his own father like a useless, obsolete burden that needed to be locked away in an asylum. Now he was literally trembling in a dark warehouse, pleading and begging for dirty money to save his superficial, arrogant ego. He had sold his soul entirely to the illusion of high society. He prioritized luxury car keys and Michelin star dinners over honor, hard work, and fundamental family loyalty. He had chosen the path of a thief, and now he was reaping the exact harvest he had sown. Cohen closed the black binder with a sharp, echoing snap that made Derek jump violently in his chair. "I am not going to authorize this loan." Derek Cohen stated, his voice a perfect instrument of corporate lethality. "In fact, no financial institution, legal or otherwise, will ever lend you another dime." Derek's face crumpled in absolute panic. Why, he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I have collateral. I have the downtown penthouse. I have the Porsche. I just need 1 week to liquidate my assets and pay you back." Cohen slid a single legally stamped document across the cold steel desk. "You have absolutely nothing," Cohen corrected him smoothly. "As of yesterday afternoon, every single piece of your outstanding debt was purchased by a private holding company. Your massive credit card bills, your luxury vehicle leases, and the balloon mortgage on your penthouse are all currently owned by a single highly aggressive creditor. By losing your executive employment today and engaging in documented corporate fraud, you have automatically triggered the universal default clauses hidden deep in the fine print of every single one of those contracts. The new creditor is calling in all the debts simultaneously, effective immediately." Derek stared at the paper, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it. He recognized the imposing black logo of Obsidian Property Management at the top of the page. "Who is the creditor?" Derek choked out, the reality of his doom finally crushing his lungs. Cohen stood up, towering over my broken son. "That is entirely irrelevant to your immediate survival," Cohen replied. "What is relevant is that you are in catastrophic, irreversible default. I am formally notifying you that a licensed repossession team will be arriving at your luxury building at exactly 2 o'clock tomorrow morning. They are taking the Porsche. They are taking the Mercedes. And a team of armed sheriff's deputies will be enforcing an immediate, unappealable eviction from your penthouse. You have until tonight to pack whatever fits into a cardboard box before you are thrown permanently onto the street." At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the pristine enforced silence of Derek's exclusive downtown high-rise was violently shattered. The heavy grinding roar of industrial diesel engines echoed through the narrow urban canyon as 3 massive heavy-duty tow trucks rolled aggressively onto the polished cobblestone driveway. Flashing amber strobe lights painted the towering glass facade of the luxury building in harsh warning colors. A highly coordinated team of licensed repossession agents and armed county sheriff's deputies marched directly past the bewildered night concierge carrying thick stacks of court-ordered foreclosure mandates. They did not pause to explain themselves or wait for permission. They moved with the cold, absolute efficiency of a corporate execution. Up in the luxury penthouse, Derek and Megan were brutally jolted from their sleep by the terrifying, authoritative pounding of heavy fists against their custom mahogany door. Before Derek could even fumble for his silk robe, the deadbolt was professionally breached. The deputies flooded the expansive, imported marble entryway. They handed a pale, trembling Derek an immediate eviction notice, giving him and his hysterical wife exactly 15 minutes to gather whatever basic necessities they could fit into 3 standard cardboard boxes. Down in the pristine underground parking garage, the repossession crew was already executing their ruthless mandate. The custom security alarms of Derek's leased pristine white Porsche and Megan's imported Mercedes SUV shrieked loudly, waking the elite residents on the lower floors. Thick steel chains were wrapped securely around the expensive customized axles. Within minutes, the luxury vehicles were hoisted violently onto the flatbed trucks, their expensive chassis groaning under the unforgiving tension of the hydraulic winches. Back up in the penthouse, Megan was screaming at the top of her lungs, desperately trying to snatch her designer handbags and expensive jewelry from the firm grasp of the repossession agents. The deputies forced them out into the hallway with zero hesitation. The heavy penthouse door slammed shut behind them, and a thick, heavy-duty steel padlock was immediately clamped over the handle. A bright orange legal notice was slapped onto the wood, sealing their absolute financial ruin. The crisp, biting night air hit Derek and Megan hard as they were unceremoniously shoved out through the main glass doors of the lobby and directly onto the cold, unforgiving concrete of the public sidewalk. They stood shivering in the harsh glow of the streetlights, wearing nothing but hastily thrown-on sweatpants and wrinkled designer sleepwear. At their feet sat 3 cheap, flimsy cardboard boxes holding a pathetic assortment of mismatched shoes, basic toiletries, and a few tangled pieces of clothing. The glamorous, untouchable world they had constructed entirely out of toxic debt and massive lies had completely evaporated into the freezing wind. The shock rapidly metabolized into a vicious, unhinged fury. Megan turned on Derek like a starving, cornered animal, her face devoid of her usual immaculate makeup contorted into a mask of pure, unrestrained hatred. "You absolutely worthless, incompetent failure," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly down the empty city block. "You promised me a $1.5 million corporate buyout. You promised me Apex Development was depositing the funds this weekend. Instead, I lose my multi-million-dollar salon, my cars, and my home all in the exact same day. You ruined my entire life." Derek, thoroughly stripped of his arrogant executive persona, completely lost his temper. He kicked one of the cardboard boxes, sending a pair of expensive high heels skittering into the dirty street gutter. "Do not dare put this on me!" Derek roared back, his face flushing a deep, furious crimson. "You are the one who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on imported Italian leather chairs for a pathetic beauty parlor that never turned a single dollar of actual profit. You maxed out 6 different credit cards to buy designer purses to impress women who secretly despise you. You dragged me into this massive mountain of debt just to feed your massive, endless vanity." Their vicious, screaming argument bounced loudly off the surrounding high-rise buildings. Across the street, the heavy glass doors of an exclusive late-night executive club opened. A group of wealthy elite socialites dressed in sharp tuxedos and glittering evening gowns stepped out onto the curb. They stopped and stared openly at the humiliating spectacle unfolding on the sidewalk. Several of Derek's former corporate colleagues were among the crowd. They pointed, whispered, and pulled out their expensive smartphones to record the pathetic downfall of the arrogant couple. Megan noticed the glowing camera lenses and tried desperately to hide her face behind her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the sheer crushing weight of public humiliation finally broke her fragile ego. Derek just stood there, breathing heavily, completely paralyzed by the utter destruction of his fake manufactured reputation. I sat in the dark, cold cab of my rusted Ford pickup truck parked discreetly in a shadowy alleyway directly across the street. I watched the entire chaotic, humiliating scene unfold with absolute, unblinking focus. My calloused hands rested steadily on the worn steering wheel. I felt absolutely no pity for the screaming man on the sidewalk. As I watched Derek kick the cardboard box in a childish rage, a sharp, vivid memory surfaced in my mind. He was exactly 7 years old. All the children in our modest neighborhood had received brand new shiny bicycles for the summer. Derek had cried for a week straight, begging me for one. I took an extra night shift sweeping the floors of a chemical plant. For 2 entire months, I ate nothing but plain boiled rice and drank tap water so I could save enough overtime pay to buy him a bright red bicycle with chrome handlebars. I starved my own body to give him a moment of pure, innocent joy. The boy who smiled so brightly that morning was completely dead. The greedy, heartless stranger standing on the sidewalk had murdered him. My fatherly heart was now pure, impenetrable ice. A sudden sharp gust of freezing urban wind swept down the avenue, catching the edge of a bright orange legal document protruding from one of the carelessly packed cardboard boxes. The heavy parchment fluttered out and landed face up on the dirty concrete directly at Derek's feet. He stopped screaming at Megan and stared down at the paper. It was the formal notarized notice of immediate default and absolute asset seizure. He fell to his knees on the freezing sidewalk, his trembling hands reaching out to grasp the document. He brought the paper close to his face under the harsh glare of the overhead street lamp. His bloodshot eyes scanned the dense, aggressive legal text, searching frantically for a way out, a loophole, or a minor clerical error. Instead, his gaze locked onto the bold, black corporate logo stamped squarely at the top of the page. Obsidian Property Management. He read the name of the holding company. Then he read the name of the parent corporation legally authorized to execute the hostile takeover of his entire life's debt. The Black Trust. The breath left Derek's lungs in a sudden, violent gasp. His mind rapidly connected the horrific, undeniable dots. The Black Trust was the exact same parent corporation listed on the architectural blueprints for the land beneath the Lakehouse. the very same holding company that owned the dirt he had tried to sell to Apex Development, the company entirely owned and operated by his father. Derek dropped the paper as if it had physically burned his hands. He collapsed entirely, his knees hitting the hard concrete, his chest heaving with the sheer terror of his realization. He had not been destroyed by a faceless, ruthless corporate bank. He had been meticulously, flawlessly eradicated by the frail, uneducated old man he had tried to starve and lock inside a psychiatric ward. Derek slowly lifted his head, looking desperately across the dark, empty street. His terrified eyes locked onto the familiar, unmistakable silhouette of my rusted Ford pickup idling quietly in the shadows. He stared at me in absolute, paralyzing dread. I shifted the truck into gear and drove slowly into the night. The digital clock on my kitchen counter shifted silently to 6 o'clock in the morning. The sun had not yet pierced the thick, heavy layer of gray winter clouds hanging over the quiet suburban neighborhood. I sat alone at my polished oak table, nursing a steaming cup of black coffee, completely unmoved by the pathetic, rhythmic sobbing echoing from my front porch. Through the reinforced security glass of my recently repaired front door, I watched the absolute spectacular destruction of their manufactured pride. Derek and Megan were collapsed on the cold, freezing concrete steps. The biting morning frost clung stubbornly to their expensive, wrinkled sleepwear. They had apparently walked miles from the downtown commercial district, dragging nothing but their shivering bodies and the crushing, suffocating weight of their newly acquired poverty. There was absolutely no trace of the arrogant corporate executive or the elitist beauty salon owner who had stood in my Lakehouse just days prior, sipping champagne and mocking my existence. They were now reduced to pure, unadulterated desperation. I listened to them turn on each other like starved, rabid wolves trapped in a steel cage. "You told me he was a clueless, uneducated old fool," Megan hissed, her teeth chattering violently in the freezing wind. "You told me the property deed transfer was absolutely flawless. You dragged me into this massive mountain of corporate debt, Derek. You ruined my entire life." Derek kept his head buried deep in his hands, his body shaking uncontrollably against the brick pillar of my porch. "You took the forged paperwork to the corrupt notary, Megan," he shot back, his voice hoarse and broken from hours of screaming on the street. "You pushed me to finalize the Apex Development deal so you could expand that useless money pit of a beauty parlor. You dug this massive grave for both of us." They continued to scream and point fingers, desperately trying to assign the blame for a sinister conspiracy they had built together. They honestly believed I was sitting inside, softening to their pathetic tears, preparing to open the door and offer them a warm blanket and a forgiving fatherly embrace. They believed the unconditional love of a parent would ultimately override the viciousness of their unforgivable crimes. They were catastrophically mistaken. I stood up, walked deliberately to the entryway, and unlocked the heavy deadbolt. The sharp metallic click made them both freeze instantly. I pulled the front door wide open. The freezing morning wind rushed into the house, but I did not shiver or retreat. I stood tall in the doorway, wearing a crisp, dark-tailored suit, looking down at the two miserable creatures kneeling on my concrete porch. Dad Derek choked out, crawling forward on his bruised knees, his hands reaching out desperately to grasp the hem of my trousers. "Please, Dad. We lost absolutely everything. The bank took the luxury cars, the sheriff padlocked the penthouse. We have absolutely nowhere to go and no money to buy food. You have to help us. We are family." I stepped back carefully, ensuring his desperate, grasping hands held nothing but empty air. I did not offer them a single word of comfort. Instead, I reached into my pocket, raised my smartphone, maximized the volume on the external speaker, and pressed play. The pristine, high-definition audio recording sliced aggressively through the freezing morning air. Megan's shrill, unhinged voice echoed across my front yard for all the awakening neighbors to hear. That pathetic old man signed the transfer papers while he was lying in a hospital bed in a deep coma. We took his thumbprint and forged the documents perfectly. He is a brain-dead fool, and I hold all the power. Megan gasped loudly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in absolute paralyzing horror. The last remaining color drained entirely from her freezing face. She realized instantly that the faceless corporate landlord who had seized her salon and goaded her into a furious confession was the very same man standing right above her. Before she could formulate a single pathetic excuse or utter a meaningless apology, I reached into my inner jacket pocket. I pulled out a thick stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs. I tossed them forcefully onto the porch, letting the cold wind scatter the damning images directly into their laps. Derek looked down, his bloodshot eyes widening as he registered the visual evidence. There were crystal-clear security captures of Megan standing at the counter of the downtown jewelry broker, happily trading Gloria's sacred antique diamond wedding ring for a stack of $100 bills. There were close-up macro shots of the pawnshop receipt bearing her legal signature. "You sold my mother's wedding ring," Derek whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of profound shock and newly ignited rage as he stared at his wife. "You told me you just pawned some of your old designer watches to get emergency cash. You stole from a dead woman to buy a leather handbag." I stated, my voice ringing with terrifying, absolute authority. "You conspired to lock a sane man in a psychiatric ward to steal his land. You do not get to come to my doorstep and use the word family to escape the consequences of your absolute depravity." Megan began to weep hysterically, her apologies tumbling out in a frantic, incoherent rush of desperation. She begged for mercy, promising to work the rest of her natural life to pay me back every single penny, swearing on her life that she had finally learned her lesson. I looked down at her fake performative tears, feeling my heart harden into impenetrable, unforgiving steel. Society often expects older men, particularly black fathers who have endured decades of systemic hardship and grueling labor, to simply absorb the trauma inflicted by their ungrateful children. We are expected to endlessly forgive, to constantly turn the other cheek, and to continuously sacrifice our own hard-earned peace to protect our bloodline from the harsh, punitive realities of the real world. But I knew with absolute certainty that shielding these predators from justice would not be an act of love or grace. It would be an act of profound, enabling cowardice. Gloria and I had built our financial kingdom on honor, grit, and unyielding integrity. Forgiving them now would be a massive, unforgivable insult to my late wife's sacred memory. I was not going to enable their toxic, destructive greed for one more second. I was going to let the ruthless, unforgiving machinery of the legal system crush them into dust. The era of unconditional protection was officially and permanently over. I looked at Derek and Megan, my expression completely devoid of any remaining paternal warmth. "I do not want your pathetic, empty apologies," I told them, my voice dropping to a low, lethal calm. "I want absolute, unrelenting justice." Right on cue, the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens shattered the quiet suburban morning. The deafening sound bounced aggressively off the surrounding brick houses. Two heavy, unmarked tactical vehicles and a standard black and white police cruiser turned sharply onto my street. They accelerated rapidly and blocked my driveway, completely cutting off any possible avenue of escape for the two criminals on my porch. The flashing red and blue strobe lights painted Derek and Megan's terrified faces in harsh, alarming colors. Neighbors began to step out onto their lawns, wrapping their robes tight, watching the spectacle unfold. 4 uniformed officers and a senior plainclothes detective stepped out of the vehicles, moving with swift, practiced, tactical precision. They marched directly up my concrete driveway, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. The lead detective, a stern man with an uncompromising gaze, bypassed Derek entirely and stopped directly in front of my shivering daughter-in-law. Megan, the detective, announced, his voice booming with undeniable, terrifying legal authority. "Please stand up and place your hands visibly behind your back." Megan froze, her eyes darting frantically between the heavily armed officers and my unyielding, stone-cold expression. Why, she sobbed, backing away until her shoulders hit the brick wall of my house like a trapped animal. "What is happening? I did not do anything wrong. It was his idea. It was all Derek's idea." The detective did not entertain her desperate, lying pleas. He grabbed her arm firmly, spinning her around and slapping a pair of heavy, freezing steel handcuffs aggressively onto her wrists. The sharp, metallic click echoed loudly over the sound of the idling police cruisers. "You are under formal arrest," the detective stated coldly, reading her Miranda rights with brutal, practiced efficiency. "You are being charged with multiple felony counts of wire fraud, the active falsification of legal property documents, grand larceny, and the targeted financial abuse of a senior citizen." Derek remained on his knees, completely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying escalation of his nightmare. He watched in absolute horror as the officers dragged his screaming, thrashing wife down the driveway and shoved her forcefully into the back of the police cruiser. He was now entirely alone, completely destitute, and completely at my mercy for his own pending criminal charges. The flashing red and blue strobe lights of the heavy police cruiser faded rapidly down the quiet suburban street, carrying Megan away toward a cold, unforgiving holding cell. The heavy silence of the freezing morning returned, leaving nothing but the biting wind and the absolute wreckage of my son's arrogant life. Derek remained on the frozen concrete of my driveway, his knees scraping painfully against the pavement. He watched the taillights disappear around the corner, his mouth hanging open in a silent, agonizing scream of pure disbelief. The reality of his catastrophic failure finally crushed whatever remaining fragments of his inflated ego still existed. He did not stand up to face me like a man. He did not attempt to salvage a single ounce of his dignity. Instead, he broke down completely. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, dragging himself over the scattered, glossy photographs of his wife pawning his mother's sacred wedding ring. He reached the bottom step of my brick porch and desperately threw his arms around my legs, burying his tear-stained face into the heavy fabric of my tailored trousers. "Dad, please." Derek sobbed, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched wail that echoed loudly off the surrounding houses. "You have to help me right now. They are going to lock her away for years in a federal prison. The bail is going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the bank literally took my last dollar last night. I have absolutely nothing left to my name. You are a multi-millionaire. You control the holding company. You have the Black Trust. Please just write a check to the bail bondsman. I will do anything you want. I will work manual labor in the lumber yard. I will scrub your floors on my hands and knees. Just do not let my wife sit in a cage." I looked down at the trembling, pathetic creature clinging to my legs. He was desperately begging for my wealth to rescue the very woman who had orchestrated my financial and psychological destruction. He wanted the man he actively tried to starve to suddenly become his ultimate savior. I did not reach down to comfort him. I did not place a reassuring hand on his shaking shoulder to ease his overwhelming panic. I took a sharp, deliberate step backward, forcing his desperate grip to slip off my legs entirely. He collapsed forward onto the freezing porch, his hands slapping loudly against the cold concrete. I reached inside my dark suit jacket and withdrew a thick, professionally bound legal document that Mr. Cohen had meticulously prepared for this exact defining moment. I tossed the heavy stack of paper onto the ground, letting it land directly in front of Derek's tear-soaked face. "I am not writing a single check to save your wife from the absolute justice she rightfully earned," I stated, my voice echoing with unyielding, terrifying authority. "And I am certainly not funding your pathetic escape from the monumental disaster you deliberately created. However, I am giving you one singular, non-negotiable opportunity to keep yourself out of a matching orange prison uniform." Derek looked down at the documents, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus on the bold legal print. "What is this?" He choked out, his breath forming thick white clouds in the freezing air. "This is your absolute and permanent surrender," I replied coldly. "It is a legally binding confession and a total asset relinquishment contract. By signing that paper, you formally admit to forging your dying mother's signature on the Lakehouse residential deed. You admit to the fraudulent commercial contract you attempted to sign with Apex Development. You permanently surrender any and all future claims to my estate, the Black Trust, and any commercial properties I possess. Furthermore, you agree to walk away from this house right now with absolutely nothing but the cheap clothes currently on your back. If you sign it, I will not hand the security footage of you breaking my wall safe over to the district attorney. If you refuse, I will make one single phone call, and that police cruiser will come right back to arrest you for breaking and entering grand larceny and elder abuse. You have exactly 2 minutes to decide your entire future." Derek stared up at me in sheer terror, finally realizing that the father he had vastly underestimated was now holding the executioner's axe directly over his head. I looked at his terrified, weeping face, and for a fleeting fraction of a second, my mind flashed back to the day he was born. I remembered holding his tiny, fragile body wrapped in a pale hospital blanket, whispering a solemn promise to the universe that I would protect him from all the evils of the world. I had spent my entire adult life building an impenetrable financial fortress to ensure he never felt the biting sting of poverty or the cruel lash of discrimination that Gloria and I had endured. but I had finally realized a fundamental heartbreaking truth about parenting. Unconditional love does not mean providing an endless, blinding shield against the consequences of a severe crime. True fatherly love sometimes requires you to establish an impenetrable boundary of solid steel. It means having the devastating courage to let your child fall completely into the dark abyss they dug, so they might finally learn how to climb out with genuine honor. Indulging his toxic greed right now would not save him. It would only validate the monster he had chosen to become. I was not being cruel. I was delivering the exact agonizing medicine his corrupted soul required to survive. Derek's shaking hands hovered nervously over the devastating legal contract resting on the frozen concrete. He read the heavy, unforgiving paragraphs detailing his absolute financial ruin and his formal written confession. He looked around the empty, freezing suburban street, searching frantically for any possible escape route, any hidden legal loophole, or any sympathetic neighbor who might intervene on his behalf. There was absolutely no one. The entire world had turned its back on his extreme arrogance. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy gold pen I had tossed next to the document. He clicked the pen, his shoulders slumping in total agonizing defeat. He pressed the gold tip against the signature line, a single hot tear dropping from his cheek and staining the thick parchment paper. He was completely broken and ready to surrender everything. Right at that exact critical second, the sharp, jarring ring of a cellular phone shattered the quiet morning tension. It was not my secure device. It was the cheap, prepaid burner phone Derek had purchased the day prior, when his corporate accounts were officially frozen. The loud, abrasive ringtone echoed loudly off the brick walls of my porch. Derek hesitated, the tip of the pen lingering just millimeters above the signature line. He pulled the cheap plastic phone from his sweatpants pocket and stared at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed the automated intake number of the county holding facility. He pressed the green answer button and put the phone on speaker, his hand shaking violently. An automated robotic voice announced a collect call from an inmate. Then Megan's voice erupted through the tiny, distorted speaker. She was not crying. She was not begging for a bail bondsman. Her voice was dripping with a frantic, venomous, and unhinged fury. "Derek, do not sign a single piece of paper that old man gives you," Megan screamed, her voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "I just spoke to my public defender. Tell your arrogant father that if he does not drop every single charge and wire the bail money to my account in the next 5 minutes, I am going straight to the district attorney. I have the ultimate trump card. Tell him I know exactly what really happened in the intensive care unit on October 17th. If I am going to prison, I am taking him right down with me for murder." The distorted voice coming through the cheap speaker of Derek's burner phone hung in the freezing air like a toxic cloud. Derek stared at the device in absolute horror, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped it onto the concrete. Megan did not pause to let her horrific accusation sink in. She pressed her advantage with the ruthless desperation of a cornered predator. "Listen to me very carefully, William," she spat, addressing me directly through the speakerphone. "I know exactly what you did on October 17th. You were alone in that intensive care unit with Gloria. You authorized the doctors to remove her life support. You pulled the plug to secure your massive hidden fortune and keep it entirely for yourself. If you do not wire $500,000 into my offshore account and drop every single felony charge against me by noon today, I will tell the district attorney everything. I will go to the local press. I will testify under oath that I witnessed you murder your own wife in cold blood to consolidate your wealth. I will absolutely destroy your untouchable reputation." Derek gasped loudly, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Mom had a massive stroke," he whispered into the phone, his voice cracking. "The doctor said her brain function was completely gone." "Megan, what are you doing?" "Shut up, Derek," she shrieked back. "He has millions of dollars sitting in his black trust. He can afford to buy my silence. $500,000, William. That is the price for my silence. If the money is not there, you will spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a federal penitentiary right alongside me." I stared at the phone, my face a completely unreadable mask of stone. The sheer, unadulterated evil radiating from her threat was staggering. She was willing to fabricate a malicious homicide investigation just to extort cash from a grieving widower. I looked at Derek, nodded once, and spoke clearly toward the phone. "Have your public defender meet me at the Central Police Precinct in exactly 1 hour. We will discuss the final terms of your payout there." I did not wait for Megan's arrogant response. I simply reached out, tapped the red button on Derek's phone, and disconnected the call. Derek remained on his knees on my frozen driveway, staring at me in sheer disbelief. "You are not actually going to pay her," he stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "She is completely out of her mind." I did not answer him. I simply picked up the surrender contract, placed it back inside my tailored jacket, and walked briskly to my rusted Ford pickup truck. I left my son kneeling in the freezing cold and drove straight into the heart of the city. I arrived at the Central Police Precinct exactly 60 minutes later. The imposing gray concrete building buzzed with the chaotic energy of shifting police rosters and ringing telephones. Mr. Cohen was already standing by the heavily fortified front desk, clutching a sleek black leather briefcase. He gave me a single grim nod. We walked together down the stark fluorescent-lit hallway toward the secure consultation rooms. Inside the cramped, windowless room sat Megan. She was no longer screaming. She sat with her arms crossed, wearing an oversized Orange County jumpsuit that completely swallowed her frame. Her expensive blonde hair was tangled and unwashed. Sitting next to her was a frantic, overworked public defender holding a yellow legal pad. The lead detective who had arrested her earlier that morning stood by the door, observing the meeting as a required, neutral party. As I walked into the room, Megan's lips curled into a victorious, sickeningly smug smile. She honestly believed her vicious blackmail had successfully cornered a multi-millionaire. She thought she had found the ultimate leverage to break my ironclad defenses. Mr. Cohen placed his briefcase on the metal table and snapped the locks open. The public defender cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. William, my client has informed me that an out-of-court financial settlement is being negotiated in exchange for her cooperation and silence regarding certain medical decisions made concerning your late wife. I demand $500,000 in untraceable funds," Megan interrupted, leaning forward aggressively, "and a signed affidavit stating that I had absolutely no prior knowledge of any forged property deeds. You will take full responsibility for the real estate transfer, William. If you refuse, I will tell this detective right now that you murdered Gloria." I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic, venomous words wash over me. A profound, consuming agony gripped my chest, threatening to shatter the cold composure I had maintained for weeks. To hear my wife's sacred passing used as a cheap bargaining chip by this vile woman was the ultimate desecration. I remembered the exact moment Gloria left this world. I remembered standing alone in that sterile, humming hospital room, holding her frail, cooling hand as the lead neurologist gently explained that her brain activity had ceased entirely. I remembered the devastating, soul-crushing weight of giving the medical staff the legal authorization to remove the artificial ventilation, honoring the strict medical directive Gloria and I had signed a decade prior. It was the single most agonizing decision of my entire existence. I had to let the only woman I ever loved slip away into the dark so she would not suffer tethered to a machine. Now this deeply greedy, superficial parasite was attempting to twist that sacred, heartbreaking act of mercy into a fabricated homicide. My grief crystallized instantly into an impenetrable, lethal weapon. I looked directly at Megan's smug, victorious face. I did not reach for a checkbook. I did not offer a single word of compromise. Instead, I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black USB drive. I placed it gently onto the center of the cold metal table and slid it directly toward the lead detective. "I am not here to negotiate a settlement," I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying absolute authority. "I am here to submit additional irrefutable evidence. When Gloria was transferred to the intensive care unit, I knew my son was desperate for cash. I knew he was surrounded by individuals who lacked a basic moral compass. So I paid a private security firm to install a discreet, motion-activated surveillance camera directly inside her hospital room." The detective frowned, picking up the small digital drive. "What exactly is on this drive, sir?" "The absolute truth," I replied coldly, never breaking eye contact with Megan. The color vanished entirely from her face. Her confident smirk collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. On October 14th, at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, that camera captured Megan sneaking past the nurse's station. I explained loudly for the entire room to hear. The high-definition video clearly shows her pulling a blank property deed from her designer purse. It shows her grabbing my comatose wife's limp, unresponsive hand, pressing her thumb firmly onto an ink pad, and stamping her fingerprint directly onto the fraudulent legal document. Megan let out a sharp, horrified gasp, pushing her chair back violently. "No," she whispered, her entire body shaking. "You are lying. You are bluffing." Check the drive, Detective Cohen interjected smoothly. You will also find the audio of her recent extortion attempt perfectly preserved. The detective pocketed the drive and immediately pulled a fresh pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. He stepped toward the trembling woman in the orange jumpsuit. "Megan," he announced grimly, "I am officially adding felony extortion, evidence tampering, and the physical assault of a comatose patient to your growing list of charges. Your bail is permanently revoked." The heavy steel doors of the Central Police Precinct slammed shut behind me with a resounding final echo. Inside those impenetrable concrete walls, Megan's arrogant, superficial world had completely collapsed into a nightmare of her own making. The lead detective had made it abundantly clear that the overwhelming mountain of digital evidence I provided guaranteed a swift, brutal conviction. She was facing a minimum of 10 years in a high-security federal penitentiary for the malicious forgery of a legal property deed, aggressive extortion, and the unforgivable physical assault of a comatose patient. Her luxury beauty salon, her designer handbags, and her elite socialite status were permanently erased, replaced by an oversized Orange County jumpsuit and the cold bars of a holding cell. I walked out into the freezing morning air, my breathing steady and my mind exceptionally clear. I drove my rusted Ford pickup truck back to my quiet suburban neighborhood. When I pulled into my driveway, Derek was still sitting on the frozen concrete of my front porch. He was exactly where I had left him. He had absolutely nowhere else to go. His sleek luxury vehicles were impounded, his corporate accounts were frozen, and his extravagant penthouse was padlocked by the county sheriff. He sat with his head buried deep in his hands, shivering violently in the biting wind. He knew the police were coming for him next. As Megan's legal husband and the primary beneficiary of the fraudulent commercial real estate contract with Apex Development, he was facing mandatory prison time as a direct active accomplice to a massive corporate conspiracy. The district attorney already possessed his recorded confessions. He had $0 to hire a defense attorney. He looked up at me with hollow, bloodshot eyes as I walked heavily up the driveway. His expensive designer suit was stained with street dirt and dried sweat. The magnificent, untouchable corporate executive was dead, completely replaced by a terrified, broken fugitive waiting for the heavy hand of the law to crush his neck. I unlocked my reinforced front door and gestured silently for him to step inside the house. It would be the very last time he ever crossed my threshold. We sat across from each other at my polished oak kitchen table. The silence in the house was thick and suffocating. Mr. Cohen arrived less than 20 minutes later, carrying a fresh, impeccably organized legal binder under his arm. Derek stared at the mahogany table, his hands trembling so violently they rattled audibly against the hard wood. He fully expected me to dial the police precinct. He expected to be hauled away in heavy steel handcuffs, just like his cruel, calculating wife. Instead, Mr. Cohen reached into his briefcase and slid a thick, heavily stamped legal contract directly in front of my trembling son. "I am giving you one singular, non-negotiable choice," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority, devoid of any fatherly warmth. "I possess the absolute power to hand the district attorney the surveillance footage and audio recordings that explicitly prove your active, willing participation in this massive conspiracy. You will easily face 5 to 10 years in a state penitentiary for your crimes. However, I am willing to formally decline to press charges against you, but only if you agree to the absolute unforgivable terms laid out in that document." Derek gasped loudly, a pathetic, desperate glimmer of hope sparking in his exhausted eyes. He lunged forward and grabbed the heavy gold pen resting on the table, entirely ready to sign anything to avoid a concrete prison cell. "Read it first," I commanded sharply, stopping his hand. Mr. Cohen adjusted his silver glasses and began reciting the crushing legal stipulations with brutal, clinical precision. First, Derek was required to sign an irrevocable, permanent waiver of inheritance. He was legally, irreversibly stripped of any future claim to the massive black trust, my personal estate, and any commercial properties I possessed. His name was permanently erased from my bloodline's financial legacy. Second, he was agreeing to a lifetime court-ordered no-contact mandate. He was strictly forbidden from ever approaching my property, calling my secure phone, or attempting to communicate with me in any capacity whatsoever. Third, and most devastatingly, he was walking out of my house today with absolutely zero financial assistance. He was legally acknowledging that he would receive no quiet bailout, no secret trust fund, and no monthly allowance. If he wanted to eat, if he wanted a roof over his head, he would have to find a minimum wage manual labor job and work with his own two hands. He would have to scrub dirty floors, haul heavy trash, or dig ditches to survive the brutal reality of the world. I watched his bloodshot eyes widen in sheer paralyzing horror as the crushing reality of the binding contract settled deep into his brain. For his entire adult life, Derek had been violently allergic to hard, honest work. He had spent years openly sneering at my faded denim jackets, my scuffed work boots, and my calloused fingers. He worshipped the superficial elite, firmly believing that his proximity to unearned wealth made him inherently superior to the working class. Sending him to a federal prison would provide him with 3 guaranteed meals a day and a warm bed provided entirely by the state. That was far too easy of an escape for a man of his unparalleled arrogance. This contract was not an act of gentle forgiveness or soft parental mercy. It was the absolute most brutal psychological punishment I could possibly inflict upon a man fundamentally obsessed with luxury and status. I was aggressively stripping away his fake corporate identity and forcing him to the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder he so deeply despised. He would have to learn the agonizing, bone-crushing value of a single dollar through his own blood and sweat. He would finally understand the grueling sacrifices I made to keep him fed when he was a child. Derek stared blindly at the binding legal document, his chest heaving with jagged, panicked breaths. He looked up at me desperately, searching my stoic face for a single ounce of hesitation, a hidden loophole, or a lingering spark of paternal rescue. He found absolutely nothing but an impenetrable fortress of cold, hardened steel. He knew with terrifying certainty that he had entirely exhausted my profound capacity for mercy. With a trembling, defeated hand, he gripped the heavy gold pen and pressed the ink firmly against the thick parchment paper. He signed his name on the dotted line, a fresh wave of hot, bitter tears rolling down his cheeks and staining the stark legal contract. He officially surrendered his entire inheritance, his family connection, and his luxurious future in a single, agonizing stroke of the pen. Mr. Cohen swiftly pulled the document away, stamping it loudly with his official notary seal, permanently cementing my son's financial and familial execution. Derek slowly pushed his chair back and stood up on shaky, unstable legs. He did not say a single word. He did not offer a meaningless, hollow apology or attempt to hug me goodbye. He slowly turned his back and walked heavily down the hallway. I listened to the sound of his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor, followed by the heavy, decisive click of the front door opening and closing. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the reinforced security window. I watched my only son shuffle slowly down the freezing concrete driveway, his shoulders slumped in absolute crushing defeat. He possessed no car, no home, no money, and no family to call his own. He stepped off my property line and walked aimlessly down the quiet suburban street, officially disappearing into the harsh, unforgiving world as a completely homeless man. The surgical removal of the toxic infection was finally complete. My vast kingdom was entirely secure, and the absolute punishment was flawlessly executed without a single drop of bloodshed. The weekend arrived with a biting chill that swept off the surface of the lake, freezing the dew on the pine needles. I drove my rusted Ford pickup truck down the familiar dirt road, the exact same path I had taken just weeks prior when my world was violently upended. This time there were no luxury sports cars crushing my flower beds. There was no thumping bass vibrating the solid timber walls. There was only the profound, absolute silence of the wilderness. I parked the truck and stepped out into the crisp air. Mr. Cohen arrived shortly after in his black sedan carrying a bottle of vintage bourbon and 2 heavy crystal glasses. We walked up the wooden steps and unlocked the front door. The heavy brass lock I had reinstalled clicked with a deeply satisfying, authoritative snap. I had reclaimed my sanctuary. We sat in the living room pouring the amber liquid in quiet camaraderie. We raised our glasses in a silent toast to a flawlessly executed victory. The hostile corporate takeover of my own life was officially dismantled. Apex Development was completely out of the picture. The forged deeds were destroyed, the legal titles were secured back under the black trust, and the toxic parasites who had infested my bloodline were utterly eradicated. Yet as the warmth of the bourbon settled in my chest, a heavy, suffocating stillness descended upon the cabin. The victory was absolute, but the battlefield was entirely empty. I looked at the vacant armchair across the room, the spot where Derek used to sit when he was a boy, eagerly carving small wooden boats with a pocket knife I gave him. That innocent child was gone forever. I was a multimillionaire, a king sitting on a massive, untouchable financial throne, but I was completely and utterly alone. There would be no family gatherings here. No grandchildren running down the dock to jump into the water. No laughter echoing in the kitchen. I had successfully amputated a rotting, gangrenous limb to save my own life, but the phantom pain of that missing piece throbbed intensely in the quiet room. I set my glass down on the heavy oak coffee table and stood up. The silence was heavy, but I refused to let it break me. I walked into the kitchen and grabbed a thick bristle brush, a bucket of hot water, and a bottle of industrial wood cleaner. I systematically began to scrub every single square inch of the cabin. I started with the hard wood floors in the entryway, scrubbing violently at the sticky, dried stains of cheap champagne Megan had carelessly spilled during her pathetic housewarming party. I tore down the tacky, superficial modern art prints she had hastily nailed to the walls to cover up the beautiful rustic landscape paintings Gloria had painstakingly sourced from local artists. I scrubbed the kitchen counters until my calloused hands ached, erasing any lingering scent of the expensive, overpowering perfume my daughter-in-law wore. I wanted to chemically burn away her arrogant footprint from my property. I moved upstairs to the master bedroom, pushing open the heavy timber door. I walked directly to the closet and retrieved the emerald green silk robe. I held the delicate fabric in my rough hands, running my fingers over the fine stitching. Megan had dragged this sacred garment across the dirty floor, treating 40 years of my hard-earned love like a cheap party trick. I carefully washed the silk by hand in the porcelain basin using gentle soap and lukewarm water, watching the tainted residue wash away down the drain. I pressed the fabric dry with a clean towel and hung it back in its rightful place of honor, locking the closet door securely. I moved through the cabin with relentless methodical precision, reclaiming the sanctity of every room. I realigned the heavy oak dining chairs, dusted the stone fireplace, and polished the framed photographs of Gloria that Megan had unceremoniously shoved into a dark cardboard box. With every sweep of the cloth and every scrub of the brush, I was aggressively taking back my history. The cabin slowly began to smell like pine wood smoke and lemon soap again. It smelled like my wife. I was physically and spiritually cleansing my sanctuary of the profound disrespect that had temporarily infected it. I walked back out to the living room, my muscles burning with a familiar, deeply satisfying exhaustion. Cohen was still sitting quietly by the fireplace, watching the flames crackle and pop, respectfully giving me the space I needed to perform my solitary ritual. I sat down heavily in my armchair and looked around the pristine, restored cabin. A deep, anchoring sense of peace finally settled over my heart. Some men in my position might view this total isolation as a tragic failure. Society constantly pushes the narrative that a man's ultimate worth is measured by a crowded dinner table in his twilight years, demanding that we tolerate absolute disrespect simply to avoid dying alone. But growing up as a black man in a world that constantly demanded I shrink myself to make others comfortable, I learned a very different truth. I learned that accepting crumbs of fake affection from opportunistic predators is a fate far worse than physical solitude. I had spent decades bending over backward, breaking my own spine to provide a luxurious foundation for a son who fundamentally despised my calloused hands. I was done shrinking. I looked at the empty room and felt a surge of cold, undeniable pride. I would infinitely rather sit alone in an empty house wrapped in absolute, uncompromising respect than share a feast with traitors waiting for me to close my eyes so they could steal the silver. Cohen reached down into his sleek black leather briefcase and pulled out a single thin manila folder. He did not open it immediately. He set it carefully on the table between us, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the thick paper. I watched his face, recognizing the serious, highly calculated expression he wore whenever we were navigating complex, dangerous legal territory. "You have reclaimed your entire kingdom," William Cohen stated, his voice low and steady over the crackling of the fire. "You have successfully neutralized every single threat. Derek is wandering the streets without a dime to his name, and Megan is sitting in a county jail cell waiting for a federal judge to seal her fate. The Black Trust is completely secure and the holding companies are operating flawlessly. However, during the final exhaustive audit of your late wife's personal estate accounts, my team uncovered one last highly encrypted financial anomaly." I narrowed my eyes, leaning forward in my chair. I thought we had frozen and absorbed every single account bearing Gloria's name. What exactly did your team find? Cohen opened the folder and slid a notarized, yellowed legal document across the oak table. He adjusted his glasses, looking directly into my eyes. This was not established using your public accounts or the corporate shell companies, Cohen explained smoothly. Gloria set this up entirely on her own, using her personal savings from before you two merged your finances. It is an independent, ironclad microtrust. She explicitly instructed her private bank to keep this completely hidden from you and the public registry until the absolute final stages of probate. I looked down at the paper, my heart skipping a sudden, erratic beat. The document was a legally binding financial directive. I read the bold text detailing a secure high-yield investment account containing exactly $250,000. "What is the execution clause?" I asked, my voice tightening with a sudden sharp wave of apprehension. Cohen tapped the bottom paragraph of the document. "Gloria left this secret fund specifically for Derek. The money is legally locked in a time-gated escrow account. It is programmed to release the entire $250,000 directly to him on his 50th birthday, completely free and clear of any external oversight." Cohen leaned back, folding his hands together. She wanted to ensure he had a final safety net in his older age. But as the primary executor of her entire estate, you hold the supreme legal authority to either honor this hidden directive or completely liquidate the trust and absorb it back into your corporate holdings right now. "So, William, what exactly are you going to do with your son's final lifeline?" I stared at the notarized document resting on the polished oak table, the flickering light of the cabin fireplace reflecting off Cohen's silver glasses. $250,000 waiting silently for Derek to turn 50. For a brief, agonizing second, I felt a sudden familiar tug in my chest. It was the innate biological instinct of a father wanting to leave a final safety net for his child. Gloria, in her infinite grace and endless compassion, had wanted to leave a hidden parachute for the boy she brought into this world. She had hoped that time would eventually mellow his arrogance and that a quiet financial gift in his later years would provide him with comfort. But leaving that parachute completely intact would fundamentally undermine the absolute brutal lesson he desperately needed to learn. If Derek ever discovered there was a massive guaranteed payday waiting for him in 15 years, he would never truly change. He would simply hold his breath, marking days off a calendar, surviving on the bare minimum while waiting for another unearned windfall instead of building his own character from the ground up. True salvation for a corrupted soul required the total, irreversible eradication of entitlement. I looked across the room at the freshly cleaned walls of the sanctuary I had reclaimed, and my resolve hardened into impenetrable steel. I knew exactly what I had to do. "Hand me the gold pen," I instructed, my voice unwavering and sharp in the quiet cabin. "I am not going to absorb this money back into my corporate holdings or the Black Trust. That would be a massive insult to Gloria's selfless, beautiful intention. However, I am legally reallocating the beneficiary clause of this microtrust effective immediately. Draft a binding, irrevocable legal directive right now. We are going to transfer the entire $250,000 into a newly established, aggressively managed educational endowment. We are going to build the Gloria Memorial Scholarship Fund. This money will be strictly and permanently allocated to provide full-ride college tuition for underprivileged Black youth in our immediate urban community. I want this capital to go directly to young men and women who wake up long before dawn to study at their kitchen tables. I want it to fund the brilliant, hungry kids who ride public transit for 2 hours every single morning just to reach their underfunded schools. I want it to bless the youth who actually understand the backbreaking, agonizing value of a single dollar, because they have watched their own parents scrub floors to survive. They will use Gloria's final sacred gift to become engineers, doctors, and architects. They will build actual sustainable futures for their families, not fake fragile empires based on toxic debt and deceit. Cohen nodded slowly, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his usual cold professional demeanor as he drafted the heavy legal amendments on the spot. I gripped the heavy pen and signed the thick parchment, officially and permanently severing the very last financial thread connecting Derek to my bloodline. The money would finally serve a noble purpose. I leaned back in the heavy leather armchair, breathing in the fresh scent of pine and lemon soap that now filled the restored cabin. Decades ago, when I was a young, exhausted man denied a basic commercial bank loan simply because of the color of my skin and the zip code I lived in, I made a silent promise to the universe. I promised myself I would one day acquire enough power to level the playing field for people who looked like me. I had foolishly tried to fulfill that promise by handing my own son the world on a silver platter, shielding him from every harsh reality I had faced. But my blind generosity had only created a spoiled, ruthless predator who despised his own roots. Now, sitting in the quiet warmth of the lake house, I was finally keeping my promise the right way. I was planting strong, viable seeds in fertile, deserving soil, rather than pouring pure water onto a rotten, dead stump. Gloria's legacy would live on in the bright minds of a new generation, rather than being squandered on designer suits and luxury car payments. 2 weeks later, the crisp, biting autumn air had fully settled over the city, turning the leaves into brilliant shades of amber and crimson. I was standing in the kitchen of my suburban brick house, sorting through the morning mail while my coffee brewed. Amidst the glossy hardware catalogs, bank statements, and utility bills, my calloused hands stopped abruptly on a small, badly crumpled white envelope. It was dirty, stained with faint, greasy fingerprints. There was no return address printed in the corner, just my name scribbled in a shaky, exhausted, and incredibly rushed handwriting that I recognized immediately. It was from Derek. My heart skipped a sudden beat. I tore open the fragile seal and pulled out a single sheet of cheap, yellow-lined notebook paper. It was covered in dark smudges and smelled faintly of industrial dish soap and stale fried food. He was not writing this from a polished mahogany table in a corporate boardroom or the balcony of a luxury downtown penthouse. He was writing from the steamy, miserable, deafening back room of a local diner, likely scrubbing dirty ceramic plates for minimum wage. I unfolded the paper carefully, fully preparing myself for another pathetic, desperate plea for a cash bailout or a legal rescue. But the very first sentence, written in blue ink, made my breath catch sharply in my throat, freezing me completely in place. I stood in the quiet kitchen reading the jagged, messy handwriting of a man who had finally been violently crushed by the brutal, unforgiving weight of reality. Dad. The letter began abruptly. I am not asking for money. I am not asking for a lawyer. I am not asking to come home. I am writing this because my hands are physically bleeding from the harsh bleach in the dish pit. My lower back is breaking from standing 12 hours a day, and for the very first time in my entirely miserable life, I understand exactly what you went through to feed me when I was a boy. I read the words again, searching for the manipulation, the hidden hook, or the subtle demand for sympathy. There was none. The letter did not contain a single excuse or an attempt to shift the blame. He detailed the sheer, unadulterated humiliation of sleeping on a thin cot in a crowded, noisy, and dangerous homeless shelter. He described the agonizing physical pain of working manual labor just to afford a cheap hot meal at the end of the night. He wrote about the profound, suffocating shame he felt knowing Megan was sitting in a federal prison cell because he had enabled and funded her toxic, bottomless greed. It was a raw, completely unfiltered confession soaked in genuine sweat and absolute humiliation. He ended the short letter with a single devastating sentence that carried the weight of a shattered soul. I am so deeply, truly sorry for betraying the only man who ever actually loved me. I read the letter twice, absorbing the heavy, painful sincerity radiating from the cheap lined paper. The old William, the naive father who had once starved himself for months just to buy his young son a bright red bicycle, would have immediately reached for his phone. He would have fired up the truck, driven straight to that greasy, miserable diner, embraced his broken boy in the alleyway, and brought him back into the warmth and safety of the house. But that father had died the exact moment he saw Gloria's forged signature on a stolen property deed. I walked slowly over to my heavy mahogany desk in the study, opened the bottom drawer, and placed the crumpled letter inside, locking it securely away with a brass key. I did not pick up my phone. I did not write a reply. I did not send Mr. Cohen to check on him. An apology written after a mere few weeks of suffering is certainly a good start, but it is nowhere near enough to erase 34 years of weaponized arrogance and a highly calculated, malicious plot to destroy my life. True redemption is not bought with a single tear-stained letter. It is earned through 10 solid years of silent, agonizing, and honorable action. Derek had to prove he could survive the harsh, freezing winter of the real world entirely on his own 2 feet. He had to build a new foundation from the dirt up before he could ever earn the right to speak to me again. I stepped out of the back door of my lake house the following weekend, walking slowly but firmly down the long, sturdy wooden dock. The crisp, clean breeze off the water filled my lungs, carrying the fresh scent of pine and open water. For years I had walked with a heavy, pronounced limp, my shoulders constantly bowed, weighed down by the endless grinding stress of managing Derek's manufactured financial crises and Megan's petty, exhausting demands. The toxic tumor of their presence had slowly been killing my spirit from the inside out, draining my vitality to fuel their illusions. Now, standing at 69 years old, my physical stride was firm, powerful, and deeply grounded. The phantom pains in my joints were completely gone. My physical and mental health had fully restored themselves the exact moment I aggressively amputated the poison from my daily life. I felt stronger and sharper than I had in 3 decades. I had reclaimed my territory, my legacy, and my ultimate peace of mind. I stood at the very edge of the dock, resting my hands on the wooden railing, watching the brilliant orange and deep purple hues of the sunset reflect perfectly off the calm, glassy surface of the lake. I had built a massive, untouchable financial empire operating completely in the shadows. I had utterly dismantled a hostile corporate takeover orchestrated by my own flesh and blood without raising my voice or throwing a single punch. And I had secured my late wife's sacred legacy forever, ensuring her grace would lift up a new generation of deserving youth. Let my story serve as a cold, undeniable warning to anyone who mistakes a parent's quiet humility and silent generosity for weakness. Society constantly tells us that parental love must be blind, endless, and endlessly forgiving sacrifice. But they are entirely wrong. True love is not blindly handing over the keys to your hard-earned kingdom to a parasite who despises you. Sometimes the absolute most profound act of love a father can perform is stripping absolutely everything away, burning their fake, arrogant world to the ground, and forcing them to walk through the ashes to learn how to be a decent human being. I turned my back to the setting sun, walked confidently back into my secure, peaceful home, and locked the heavy door behind me. There is one final truth I want you to take away from my journey. Real power does not roar from the top of a glittering penthouse or hide behind leased luxury cars. Real power is the quiet, unwavering certainty of knowing exactly what you have built and refusing to let parasites tear it down. Wealth can easily buy comfort, but it can never purchase character, loyalty, or a clear conscience. Protect your peace fiercely, guard your assets wisely, and never let anyone convince you that your age makes you obsolete. If my story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more life lessons on defending your dignity.